Hello, everyone. On behalf of the UHIN Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you to the UHIN Annual Forum. My name is Sarah Vandermolen, and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping items. If you're on the line and have not yet connected to the webinar, click the link in your confirmation email. Your browser may prompt you to download and run a file. When you're connected, you should see the welcome slide on your screen. Today's topics focus on answering the biggest questions about patient data access, interoperability, and the future of healthcare. We're excited to welcome so many distinguished guests, and we hope that you'll be tuning in to each of their sessions. Today's sessions are in the style of Ask Me Anything. Each set of presenters will provide some information on their topic to set the stage, and then the floor will be open for questions. You'll be using Zoom's Q&A function to send in your questions. Please take a moment and find the chat bubble icon near the bottom and center of the webinar screen. Once a question is submitted, everyone will be able to see it. If you agree with a question and would like to see it answered, you can upvote the question by clicking the thumbs up icon on the left. You can also comment on the question if you would like to add information. We will be prioritizing the questions that have more interest around them, so make sure to upvote your favorites. When you submit questions, please keep them short, clear, and professional. Any questions that are unprofessional or antagonistic will be dismissed by the moderators. Also, before submitting one of your own, check to see if someone else has submitted a similar question that you can upvote. This will help the topics you care about rise to the top of the list. Now it's time to begin with our guests from the ONC. I'd like to welcome Steve Posnack, the Deputy National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, and Elise Sweeney-Anthony, Executive Director of the Office of Policy at the ONC. Steve and Elise, I'll hand it off to you now.
All right, thanks very much, Sarah. I am going to find the screen with my presentation very quickly and make sure I got that loaded. All right, how are we doing?
It is just starting to share. There you go.
All right, very good. All set. All right, I'm driving the slides for today, so Elise gets to kick back and just give you the overall. So welcome again. My name's Steve Posnack. I serve as the Deputy National Coordinator for Health Information Technology at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. Joined here by Elise Sweeney-Anthony, who is our Executive Director of the Office of Policy, my partner in policy making in most cases. Elise and I have worked together a number of years at ONC, both from a technology and policy perspective, and we are wish we could be there in person with you, but certainly here in spirit with you today to give you a brief update on the ONC Cures Act final rule. As many of you are aware, this was released in March, if you can believe it, so long ago, right before all of us, kind of changed the way in which we live. But the rule formally published after a few weeks in the Federal Register on May 1st, which as a person who's done rulemaking for the better part of a decade, I think it's the first time that I've had a final rule published on the 1st of a month, which once I get to the timeline slide, since that's part of my presentation, it makes the calculation of a lot of the dates much easier for everybody involved, including us policy wonks. So with that, I will let Elise introduce herself when she gets her turn at the slides. I'm going to dive right in. We both have kind of a 1-2 punch for you today, and then we're going to leave some available time to take your questions. All right, I'll get my slides to actually move. All right, there we go. Just one quick thing. There are a number of summary provisions in the slides. If you want to consult the explicit and discrete provisions and policies, please consult the Code of Federal Regulations. Part 170 is the conditions of certification program overall. And then when it comes to Part 171, that's the new section related to information blocking. Okay, one other thing, first and foremost, thank you for all of you that are involved in COVID-19 response activities. If you are interested in health IT related resources, we have a general page that's available on healthit.gov, which is that top link there. We also have been making updates to our interoperability standards advisory for COVID-19 related standards work. And if you're involved in a pilot, project, prototype, demonstration, something tech and healthcare related, and you want to share your work with folks across the nation, the Interoperability Proving Ground, I believe now has close to, if not over 100 projects for people working on COVID-19 related interoperability and health technology efforts. So you can check that out again at the link there. And we'll make these slides available if we haven't already passed them along for your benefit for later. The other one thing to note, as we released our rulemaking, we also put up a statement of regulatory policy related to enforcement discretion by adding an additional 3 months to each of the initial compliance dates or timelines identified in the Cures Act final rule. So when I cover the, let's call it stock or default timeline later in the slide deck, you always have to do kind of a plus 3 months associated with those timelines to get a full sense of both what we set out in the final rule as well as the additional enforcement discretion that we included therein. So our agenda today is pretty simple. I'm going to take on the certification program overview with conditions of certification and then turn it over to Elise to take on, quite frankly, the more interesting topic, which is the new policy associated with information blocking. All right, so updates to the 2015 edition certification criteria. For those of you that have tracked ONC's work over time, you may be familiar with the edition structure that we've had for our certification criteria. Our last major edition rulemaking was in 2015, as the name suggests, and that was aligned with the meaningful use last stage 3 rulemaking when that was in its full naming convention and swing. And those 2015 edition certified products were just finally required for compliance as part of CMS promoting interoperability programs in 2019. So there's always that lag between, regulatory release, rollout, design, development, testing, certification, and all that in between in order to get it in the hands of providers and then them actually using it for a CMS program reporting requirement. So as we looked at our rulemaking for implementing the 21st Century Cures Act, we looked at, are there cleanup activities that we should do? Are there certification criteria that are no longer giving us that bang for the buck? And are there opportunities for us to clarify, add in further support activities as part of the 21st Century Cures Act? And so one thing that we did was a transition between what was previously referred to as the Common Clinical Data Set to something that we now refer to as the U.S. Core Data for Interoperability. And the things that are annotated here on the slide as new represent data elements or data classes that we've added to in addition to what was the baseline of the Common Clinical Data Set that's still part of our rulemaking today. So when it comes to new 2015 edition certification criteria, they reference the U.S. Core Data for Interoperability. When it comes to the existing 2015 edition certification criteria that we have, some of them are going to get updated and expanded to include the new data elements and classes that are referred to by the U.S. Core Data for Interoperability. That can be accessed at the healthit.gov website and /USCDI. And we will be opening up and operating an annual process to gather more data. It's going to be participatory from your point. So as you work in the field on health IT related initiatives and there are data that you feel are ready for inclusion in the USCDI, there'll be a process and an approach for you to submit that information and help build the body of evidence for including data in the USCDI in the future. So when it comes to updates to the 2015 edition certification criteria, we have a kind of a spectrum of changes to our 2015 edition. And now we're going to start to refer to them as the Cures update. So when you start to see that lingo, don't be surprised. When it came to new certification criteria as a result of implementing the law, we had very few additions to the 2015 edition, to enunciate between edition and editions. So we had 2 new technical certification criteria. The first related to electronic health information, which is a term of art that's shared between information blocking and the certification program. And that's about exporting all the data that meets the electronic health information definition that a certified product would have at the time it's presented for certification. And then the second criterion relates to the standardized API for patient and population services. And so this is the FHIR-based, if you're familiar with fast healthcare interoperability resources. This is the FHIR-based API certification criterion that we've now adopted in our rule. You may recall that we had an API certification criterion, actually a number of them, in our 2015 edition, but left it functionally specified. So we didn't require a standard 5 years ago, effectively. And now, as part of this rulemaking, the updated certification criterion references the FHIR standard as well as other implementation specifications to further constrain API-based interaction. There are two other new certification criteria that are what we describe as attestation in nature. So they don't require any new design or development from the health IT developer perspective, but they would add additional transparency when they're listed with products on the certified health IT product list. There are a number in this center column here that are revised certification criteria. Many of them are revised in part because of the new reference or the replacement reference to the US core data for interoperability. And so a number of the interoperability, a transactional summary care record, and other types of certification criteria that referenced the original common clinical data set are now being updated to the US core data for interoperability. And there's a timeline and a compliance timeline that we lay out to allow for both health IT developers as well as healthcare providers to get that updated health technology. When it comes to the last column here to the right, we have what we refer to as time-limited or even removed certification criteria. So in some cases, the capabilities are now built in after 10 years of having been regulated and just steady EHR adoption, that having them certified was not, from both stakeholder feedback as well as our assessment, adding additional value from a certification perspective, and where we look at opportunities, again, as I mentioned, to, in this case, reduce regulatory burden for health IT developers. So we've removed a number of them, as well as there's a little bit of a tail end for the Medicaid EHR incentive programs, where some of them will phase out after a small period of time once the usage of certain certification criteria is no longer required by those particular programs. So as a whole, I just wanted to cover on this slide, even though there looks like there's a lot of moving and shaking related to the 2015 edition, there really are very few overall changes to its structure as a whole, and targeted changes when it comes to updates that require future compliance. So I'm going to talk briefly to give you the lay of the land and overview of the conditions and maintenance of certification. So important thing to keep in mind from a statutory perspective was that Congress included really two statutory sections that we've implemented in a single rule. We otherwise could have issued two separate rulemakings, but there's a lot of interdependence, as you may see, relative to both my portion of the presentation as well as Elise's. And you'll also hear from Elise about the covered actor, as we may refer to them from an information blocking perspective, that being developers of certified health IT, which are shared between the certification program and the information blocking related provisions and implementation. So when Congress laid out the conditions and maintenance of certification section of the 21st Century Cures Act, they focused on really two components, both the condition of certification as well as the maintenance of certification. And as we have sought to implement and execute on the law through our regulatory requirements, we've included both types of policies, some that are just a condition of getting certified, and others that are required to, for health IT developers to require to continue to meet and to continue to perform in order to maintain their certificate. So that's a fundamental change and a difference between how our certification program was constructed prior to the 21st Century Cures Act, and now with the implementing regulation, there's this kind of continuity and continued obligation across a number of different facets for health IT developers to meet requirements for the program overall. So there are 7 conditions of certification that were laid out in the statute. The first, information blocking, again, is that intersection between the certification program and the information blocking provisions. And that says a developer of certified health IT can't engage in information blocking activities. The second one, which we refer to as assurances, requires that health IT developers provide the secretary with certain assurances around the access, exchange, and use of electronic health information, that they won't engage in information blocking again. And all of those have been implemented in kind of specific and discrete policies. We include the electronic health information export certification capability as one of those assurances to prove to HHS at large that you're enabling electronic health information to be exchanged. One of those ways is to make sure that your product is compliant with the EHI export certification criterion. The third condition of certification here revolves around communications. And so in this case, the statute said that health IT developers cannot prohibit or restrict certain communications that would be made about their products. And there's a number of dimensions underneath this statutory provision around security, around interoperability, around the user experience and usability of the health IT product. And all of those are the various different dimensions that we tackled in the final rule to explain, here are the types of communications that can't be prohibited or restricted by a health IT developer. So again, as a quick pause here, it's important to keep in mind that the conditions of certification are a real fundamental change to our certification program. You know, previously you may be familiar that our certification program just focused on the software, and it went through electronic testing, et cetera, and it didn't really revolve around the health IT developers' business practices. And the statute really changed that dynamic for us, where all of these conditions of certification apply to the health IT developer as a company as a whole. And so you can have, let's say, oversight situations now in the future for ONC, where a health IT developer may have a perfectly technically conformant product. You know, let's say it does e-prescribing appropriately, but they violate one of these other conditions of certification that would apply to their business practices as a whole. And so it's a different angle and a different trajectory for us from an oversight perspective to keep in mind as we mature, you know, the program requirements through the rule. The fourth one I already touched on, you know, briefly with the reference to the new certification criterion. This is around the, as you probably heard from ONC, on repeat prior to the final rule being issued, the publication of application programming interfaces without special effort. And we've included both business practices associated with this condition of certification for health IT developers, as well as technical requirements through the certification criterion for them to meet as well. And then the fifth one here is related to real-world testing. So again, another obligation for health IT developers as a whole for the products that they present for certification. They would now have this subsequent responsibility to engage in real-world testing for those products over the course of the year. And we've included a specific scope to focus on interoperability-related certification criteria, but nonetheless, this is an ongoing maintenance of certification requirement for health IT developers. And then no government program is built without an attestation requirement. And so we have, as specified in the law, a requirement that health IT developers attest that they are abiding by these conditions and maintenance of certification requirements on a twice-a-year basis. There's one more here, that's the EHR reporting criteria. That is a seventh condition of certification. We are still going through the process of implementing that. It had its own separate statutory section as well. And so as we start to work through that and finalize reporting criteria against which EHR developers would have to submit information, et cetera, we will build that into our regulatory paradigm overall. All right. So last slide, if I'm not mistaken. This gives you an overview of the kind of compliance timeline and all the various bits and pieces that I talked about. I'm going to focus on the top half of the slide here. So you see we're in 2020, working from left to right. We had a publication date officially in the Federal Register of May 1st. And when it comes to regulations, there's something called the effective date. And the effective date means in a very specific way when the text is entered into the Code of Federal Regulations, when the text is visible, has the force of law from a regulatory perspective. And then there are other compliance dates and timelines by which we included in our rule to give the industry time both to develop updates to their software and roll those out, as well as to build in the processes that we needed to from a certification perspective. So just to piggyback on that related to the real world testing, we have an annual requirement for real world testing. And part of that is to be transparent about the planning as well as the results associated with real world testing. So the first real world testing plans would be due at the end of December of this year. You have to add in that kind of 3 months of enforcement discretion. But generally speaking, every year after this year, real-world testing plans will be due, and they'd be made publicly available on the Certified Health ID product list. Similarly, when it comes to the attestation for the conditions of certification, that one will happen next spring for the first time. And then if you start to shift into 2022, the new API certification criterion, as well as any of the certification criteria that needed to be updated for the US CDI, among a few others, those all need to be updated and rolled out to healthcare providers for their use no later than the 24 months after publication. So in the intervening time right now between May 2020 and May of 2022, there's going to be lots of work going on by industry to get these updates out to the healthcare provider community. And it's important to kind of keep in mind how that juxtaposes or jives with information blocking, which in some respects has a simpler timeline to keep in mind. And I'll cover this briefly for Elise, but I'm sure she'll emphasize this again. For the compliance timeline associated with information blocking, we determined that we wanted to give industry, because of both the breadth of stakeholders that are covered by the law in general, as well as the novelty in general of the policies overall, to give stakeholders more time to both adjust, educate themselves, develop and prepare ways in which they would need to comply. And we gave a 6-month compliance date for the publication of the rule. So in November, that will be the first kind of milestone period for when information blocking will, from an overall policy perspective, will begin. And then we have this staggered phasing approach for the scope of the data that would be applicable as well, which I'm sure Elise will touch on as part of her presentation too. So with that said, I am going to turn it over to my colleague Elise. I will drive the slides for you, Elise, and just let me know when you need to transition.
All right, much appreciated. Steve and I often tag team, so it's always a joy when we get to present together. And so thankful that he'll be moving the slides for me. And on that note, next slide. I always like to start with a thank you, because getting to where we are with this rule, with this final rule, really, this is the start of implementation, but the process for developing the regulation was very much a success because of the work of stakeholders to comment on the rule. So for all of the commenters on the line who took the time to tell us your thoughts, whether you agreed with what we were proposing or you disagreed, all of that feedback was very helpful as we were trying to think about how to have a rule on both the certification program side as well as the information blocking side that is effective, that works on the ground, that meets what Congress has asked us to do. So I always want to start with that. We received more than 2,000 comment submissions. We read every one, and I, as a regulator, as a lawyer, I'm always thrilled to see that much engagement in policy development. So I thank you for that. So today I'm talking about information blocking. I always think a good place to start in terms of information blocking is what are the elements. Now, of course, I will tell you this rule is a long rule, even in the tri-column format, as Steve mentioned earlier. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight some key areas. On our website, we have a number of resources. We have webinars that delve very specifically into information blocking, including one that we did, which includes question and answers from the audience as well, which I know we will do here at the end of this presentation. So I do want to encourage folks to take a look at the rule, read some of the resources we have online, but I will provide a little bit of an overview of some of the provisions that are included. So starting with information blocking as a definition, Congress lays out the definition of information blocking. I'm going to bounce around the slide a little bit. First, let's start with knowledge. So when we think about what does it mean to be an information blocker, you start with knowledge and you start with actor. At least that's how I like to think about it. So the actors we'll talk about in a second. There are 4 actors that Congress lays out in the CARES Act. But depending upon the actor, there's a different knowledge standard that attaches. If you are a health information network, health information exchange, or if you are a developer of certified health IT, then a different knowledge standard attaches. And that knowledge standard is you knew or you should have known that what you were doing could be considered information blocking. If you are a healthcare provider, the knowledge standard is different. It's did you know? So those are important. For those who are lawyers on the line, that difference I'm sure will sound familiar to you. But it's important to think about as we look at all of the elements that are identified here. All right, so let's go back up to the top again of the slide and focus on the second bullet, which is electronic health information. And that's what Steve had alluded to a little bit on the timeline slide. And how we define electronic health information, we'll talk about in a second, but it's really important because when you think about, are you a potential information blocker? Are you an actor that's covered? Are you moving the set of information that is considered to be electronic health information? Is the practice that you are doing likely to interfere with access, exchange, or use of that EHI? The knowledge standard we talked about already. Is the sharing of is your failure to share the information required by law? And then also, are you covered by an exception? So perhaps you would normally be considered an information blocker, but an exception applies. And that's really important because Congress specifically lays out in the Cures Act that they would like OMC to think about what are the reasonable and necessary activities that do not constitute information blocking. And as we go through the slides, you'll see that there are many situations, as I'm sure folks on this line are familiar with, where information is not shared. Perhaps it's a privacy consideration why information is not shared, or there's a security consideration that applies. And in some cases, it could be that you cannot share that information. Maybe you're not able to from a technical perspective. When we were thinking about the exceptions that would apply, we really spent some time thinking about the on-the-ground scenario of how information moves, what might cause information not to move, what are those real-world scenarios. But we also thought about where we wanted to see information be in terms of information moving to support care, to support the needs of patients. So that's how I think about generally the elements that constitute information blocking. We'll spend some time going through some of these as well as some time going through the exceptions. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about kind of the penalties, the consequences, if you are determined to be an information blocker. And here's a good opportunity for me to talk about the enforcement structure. Steve alluded to this a little bit, but when we think about enforcement, Congress has laid out that the Office of the Inspector General handles a lot of the enforcement related to who is considered to be an information blocker. So the investigatory structure would sit with OIG in many cases. As Steve noted, for certified developers of health IT, there is an information blocking component that's located in the certification program, and that as well was decided by Congress to be included. And I think that's an important thing to highlight, that Congress not only included an entire section on information blocking, but also took the time to also include to note information blocking as part of the certification program, to highlight that if you are a developer of certified health IT, that the expectations that you are not information blocking. And in fact, that is included as a condition. So when we think about, when we think about the penalties that associate for information blocking, if you are a health IT developer of certified health IT, if you are a health information network or a health information exchange, you can be subject to up to $1 million per violation in civil monetary penalties. If you are a healthcare provider, then your penalties would be appropriate disincentives as determined by the Secretary. Now, for healthcare providers, we included on behalf of HHS a request for comment in the proposed rule to ask what do stakeholders think would be appropriate disincentives to be considered for healthcare providers. All of those comments have been received. We've shared those with HHS, and HHS is now in the process of thinking about what those appropriate disincentives should be. So those have not been determined yet. In addition, I mentioned this in terms of the information blocking condition of certification. So you see here in that second major bullet that it is possible that a health IT developer of certified health IT could be subject to a certification ban if they are in fact information blocking. Next slide. All right, so the compliance timeline, this is also important, I'm sure, for many folks on the line. So I'll spend a little time talking about this. As Steve said, the information blocking provision becomes effective 6 months after publication. So that's the beginning of November is when information blocking requirements will be in place. Now, from now until then, we encourage folks to really get familiar with the provisions that we've laid out, to take some time, check out the website, check out the rule itself, and really look at what you would be held to if you are considered to be an actor. And equally so, if you are the requester of information, knowing what your what the provisions say are also important to you, because as I'll note at the end of the slide, we do have a feedback form, and we have a way for folks to let us know if they see information blocking happening in the field. And I'll talk about that at the end as well. So in terms of enforcement, related to the civil monetary penalties, which would be determined by OIG. Office of Inspector General actually has a notice of proposed rulemaking out right now. I encourage folks to check that out. It is important because that is how OIG is thinking about how they will enforce the provisions of information blocking that they are responsible for. In particular, focus on, as I said, the health information networks, health information exchanges, and the developers of certified health IT. A couple of things that we did note in our rule, just to highlight here, that at a minimum, the time frame for enforcement will not begin sooner than the compliance date of the ONC final rule, and will depend upon when the CMP rules themselves are final. Rule is final. In addition, discretion will be exercised such that the conduct that occurs before the CMP rule is final will not be subject to information blocking CMPs. So please do check out the Office of Inspector General rule, and I encourage folks to comment. I always tell folks, we read every single comment. We consider every single comment in developing policies. So if you have thoughts on implementation, on enforcement, I encourage folks to comment on the OIG rule as well. Next slide. All right, so now let's talk about the actors. Now I said 4 actors if you guys were listening earlier, and it is 4 actors. But one of the things that we did in the final rule is we combined the definition of health information networks and health information exchanges. So let's go and talk through each of these actors and what that means. So healthcare providers, we actually use a definition that exists in the Public Health Service Act, and point directly to that. Now there are some stakeholders that will be familiar with the list of healthcare providers, and we do have that on our website as well. But including providers and laboratories, pharmacies, and so forth. But there might be some that you are not as familiar with. So I do encourage folks to take a look at the full list of healthcare providers to see if you might be covered or potentially covered under that definition. Secondly, health IT developers of certified health IT. I won't spend too much time on that because I think Steve highlighted how that dovetails with our certification program. But those are entities that are certified under ONC as part of our certification program. And then the last category I will spend some time on, which is around health information networks and health information exchanges. In the proposed rule, we actually had 2 different definitions here, and we received a lot of comment regarding the similarities that can exist and the possibility that it may be hard to differentiate between the 2. So what we did is we actually combined the definitions, and there's 2 things to focus on. We noted that for you to be considered a health information network or health information exchange, you have to be capable of exchanging between 3 or more entities. So that's an important differentiation. The second piece is that we noted that the exchange or the access exchange and use of the EHI would relate to treatment, payment, and operations as those terms are defined by HIPAA. And this is a great point for me to highlight that one of the things we did in the rule is we really focused on thinking about the landscape of federal policy that stakeholders are interested in or are held accountable to. And HIPAA is one that comes up a lot for obvious reasons. So you'll see that there's points where we point back to HIPAA in terms of the requirements, and we use definitions or policy constructs that exist in the HIPAA landscape. We worked very closely with the Office of Civil Rights that's responsible for implementation and enforcement of HIPAA to make sure that we were striking the right balance between what we finalized in our rule and what exists in the HIPAA landscape as well. Next slide. All right, so now let's talk about the definition of electronic health information. So what do we know so far? We know the definition of information blocking, we know the actors, we know the potential penalties, but what is the body of information that's expected to move from one entity to the other when we think about information blocking? So in the proposed rule, we laid out a construct that focused on HIPAA and included some references to HIPAA. And in the final rule, we went even further. We very much focused the definition and the scope of EHI to mean electronic protected health information, or EPHI, to the extent that that EPHI is included in what's called the designated record set. And that term, the designated record set, is defined by HIPAA. And in addition, that applies whether the actor is considered a covered entity for HIPAA purposes or not. So that's an important distinction. One thing that I did want to note is the set of information changes depending upon the time period. So from the time of November, when the effective date for information blocking comes into effect, to 18 months after that, what has to be moved is an even smaller set. And that smaller set is the data elements that would normally be represented in the U.S. core data for interoperability. Now, here is always where I provide a little extra focus on this, because the U.S. core data for interoperability, as Steve laid out, includes kind of standards references. It's a whole body of set of information that we think needs to be able to move. What we're saying by what has to move in the first 18 months after the effective date is the data that's represented in there. So it may be that you don't have that data represented in the USCDI format per se, but if you have the data that is included, even if it's not in that standard format, that is still the data that has to move for that first 18 months. After the 18 months, the net widens a bit more, and it's not just the information that's represented in the USCDI, it goes to that full set of data that would be represented in the designated record set. And that's an important note, that the set of data that exists in the designated record set is established by HIPAA, and we will point to that and continue to look to HIPAA and the Office of Civil Rights in terms of their implementation of the DRS. Okay, next slide. All right, so now to the information blocking exceptions. So you know who's covered, you know what the penalties are, you know the definition of the set of data that has to move. Now, what if all of those situations are met and you are in fact potentially an information blocker? Here is where the exceptions may come into play. Now, I'm going to spend a good amount of time on this slide, but I'm also watching my time, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit. But the first thing to note and to remind folks is that the analysis of whether an entity is an information blocker is a case-by-case analysis. And that was very purposeful on the part of ONC. And that's because how information blocking happens varies on a case-by-case basis, even amongst an individual actor. We've received a lot of comments. We've heard from a lot of stakeholders all the way back to when we released the information blocking report that Congress had requested, and I think it was 2015, so long ago now. But even back then, we saw that information blocking happens in many different ways, and we want to be prepared for that. We want to recognize that in some cases, something that may be information blocking may not be information blocking in another case because of the variance in the fact pattern. And that's a lot of what the investigation would uncover, a lot of what Office of Inspector General would be looking at as part of their enforcement as well. With that in mind, let's talk about the exceptions, and I'm going to group some of them. So if you look through 1 through 5, on the left hand of your screen, you'll see that these exceptions are one that if this exception is met, then you do not have to move the information in many cases. What we do try to encourage is if the exception is met, that you still try to think about how you can move information, and that's what you see on the right hand of your side, which is exceptions 6 through 8. Now, in the proposed rule, we proposed actually 7 exceptions, but one of the things that we heard a lot in comments about was the need to provide some additional clarity and additional structure around how, the what and the how, the what information is moving and how that information moves. So I'll spend some time talking about the content and manner exception in a bit. So when we look at the preventing harm exception, the privacy exception, and the security exception, in those exceptions, you really see that there is a focus and an alignment with HIPAA as throughout our entire rule, but particularly here because there's a lot of the scenarios also dovetail with some of the HIPAA constructs. Particularly in the privacy exception, there are a number of sub-exceptions that can be considered. Some examples of what might be considered for as a sub-exception is situations where there is an existing law that says there's a condition that must be met before the information can be shared. So maybe an authorization is needed or a consent is needed. And if the actor doesn't share the information until that consent or authorization is received, then that would be considered as whether is that truly information blocking. But again, the goal would be for that consent or authorization to be in place so that the information can move where it needs to be to support care. So that's an example of how the privacy exception works. In security as well, the same concept is that we want to make sure that, yes, there are policies in place that support the secure movement of information, but that security is not being used as a proffer or as an inappropriate reason for not sharing information. So one of the things that we notice is the failure to share information something that's based upon a policy that's already in place, a law that's already in place. If it is a policy of the actor, is the actor actually following the same policy depending upon who's requesting it? So if a requester is requesting information and that actor has a relationship with that requester for some reason, they share the information, but the same scenario arises, but the requester in the second case is a competitor, those are examples of what would be looked at to see whether it is truly a security concern or is it just an excuse or a way not to share information for in this case, not to be non-competitive. And that's an opportunity for me to highlight a couple of other things. Throughout the exceptions, throughout the information blocking provisions, you will note that we really focus on making sure that we're supporting a competitive environment. So information is moving where it needs to go, regardless of whether the person who is requesting it is a friend of the entity, as it were, or whether it is a competitor for which you have no relationship. We want to make sure information is moving where it needs to go, and we do not want anti-competitive behavior to be a way to restrict, to be a reason why information is not moving. The other thing to note is a couple of high-level components related to one of the comments, or many of the comments, I should say, actually, that we received around an actor who receives a request from a patient through an app. So the patient says, "App, please go and access my data from X, actor." And the actor does have the ability, and we highlight this in the interference section of the rule, of the information blocking side of the rule, we note that a actor does have the ability to say and to share information about what they may know about that third-party app. We do want to make sure that when you're sharing information, again, it is not in an anti-competitive spirit, that you are being objective in how you're sharing information, and that you're not using biases as part of that. So all of that's highlighted in the rule, and I think it's responsive to many of the comments we received in that area. When it comes to infeasibility and health IT performance, a couple of things I want to highlight here. Both of these exceptions really focus on there may be a reason why information does not move. It perhaps could be because there is a natural disaster that has occurred that has impeded the ability of the information to move. And that's some of those things are highlighted in the infeasibility exception. One of the things we also know in infeasibility that is really important for us to consider situations where data perhaps cannot be segmented as easily as an entity would like it to be. So if you cannot segment data, that should not be shared. So there's, perhaps a law that says you cannot share a certain amount of information and you can't separate that from the other body of information, then perhaps the infeasibility exception may apply. So that's another one to look at as well. In terms of health IT performance, this sounds pretty much like what it is. There may be situations where the performance of the health IT has to be degraded for updates or things of that nature. Those are real life situations that we understand that actors go through, and we want to allow the situations for the upgrades to occur, for degrading the health IT temporarily in order to make sure that those kind of advancements occur, and that's what that exception focuses on. Again, you'll continue to see words like objective, policies related to when you're doing that. Now let's spend a little bit of time on the exception 6 through 8, particularly on the content and manner exception. So the content and manner exception is important because it answers the what and the how. What is the body of information that has to move? And I talked about that a little bit in terms of what happens in the first 18 months after the effective date. So after November, 18 months, it's really the data elements, the data that's represented in the US CDI or the US Core Data for Interoperability. After that, you move to the broader set of the EPHI represented in the designated record set. So let's talk about the manner. So the manner, there's two categories. We recognize that there could be situations where actor and the requester of the EHI have come to an agreement about what information should be shared and the policies and the ways and the fees even and the technological means by which the information is shared. And we want to support that. So if that happens, then that is okay, and we support that as part of the structure of the manner side of the exception. But there may be situations where agreement cannot be reached, where an HIE, for example, or a health information network or the certified health IT developer do not come to an agreement with the requester on how the information should be shared, or the fees or licensing or things of that nature. And if they don't come to agreement, then it defaults to what we call the alternate mechanism, the alternate manner for sharing information. And there you'll see a couple of things. One, we start with sharing information using standards identified by ONC. So those could be the ones noted in the certification program, for example. Think USCDI as an example, but not the only components to think about there. But if not, then we go down and we default then to standard development organizations. So entities that have established standards that are well recognized. In that situation, if you can't send the information using ONC standards, then you can also use standards that are send the information using standards identified by standard development organizations. And we go all the way down to the last option, which is related to sending the data in a machine-readable format. And as you can imagine, and I'm usually a hand talker, so I'm going to use hands for this one. You start with the ONC standards, and then you move to standards development, and then moving down to the machine-readable. But you don't get to machine-readable if there's a way for you to send it using a standardized format. And this really aligns to what we at ONC really focus on around interoperability, supporting the movement of information in a standardized way, so that when it gets to the envelope, the receiver of the information, that it can be not just opened, but used, and used as part of care, used as part of advancing the care continuum. So that's generally the structure of how the exceptions work. In the case of the fees and licensing exceptions, those really come into play mostly when you think about the alternate manner. So in the alternate manner, the fees and licensing exceptions are important because obviously the entity, the actor, and the requester have not reached agreement on how to move information. So that's where the fees exceptions and the licensing exceptions will come into play. Okay, next slide. All right, so the complaint process, and I just want to highlight this briefly, but there's an entire kind of portal on our website that focuses on this. It's the Health IT Feedback and Inquiry portal. Not only can you tell us what you think about ONC in particular areas, but there's an actual button that focuses specifically on information blocking. So if there's a complaint that you are interested in providing around information blocking that you think may be happening, you can submit that on ONC's website. Now, the process for that, you can submit it anonymously, but keep in mind, if you do submit it anonymously, it limits our ability to find out more from you. We're not able to kind of follow up, but we will have the information. And there is a button specifically for anonymous submission. We received a lot of comments around thinking about the process for information blocking generally, and that includes some comments that we received around the complaint process. We plan to implement it, as I've mentioned so far right now, and we will evolve that over time. Next slide. All right, and this is one other point I just wanted to highlight. The Cures Act also includes a provision related to the receipt of information around information blocking. And specifically, it says that any information received by ONC in connection with a claim or a suggestion of possible information blocking that could reasonably, and this is important, reasonably be expected to facilitate identification of the source of the information, it would fall under protections that relate to FOIA. So keep that in mind when you're submitting as well. And again, please check out our website. It's healthit.gov/cures rule, and that will lead you to the portal, or you can just go to our main page. Oh, perfect transition. Thank you, Steve. So here's where you can find not only the fact sheets, not only the rule itself, but you can also find how to submit questions to us regarding the rule. And this is important, but I know we're going to spend some time answering questions, but there may be some questions that we want to have submitted through our portal so that we can identify similarities between other questions and potentially release a frequently asked question. So we'll answer the questions that we absolutely can, and in some cases where it's a super specific fact pattern, we may not be able to answer those. Those may come more into the enforcement area by OIG. But with that, I'll turn it back over for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, both Steve and Elise. As far as questions go, we already have several that have gotten some upvotes. A reminder to attendees, please go through the list of Q&As that have already been entered and upvote your favorites, because we're going to be prioritizing the ones with the most interest around them. The first one is, will there be further guidance as organizations start implementing? More examples or best practices? What resources will there be to assist as time goes on?
Great question. I can answer that one. I mentioned it a little bit in terms of the feedback portal, but we will be adding a frequently asked questions to our website. So where there's similarities and commonality between the questions that we're receiving, or some clarification would be helpful, we'll be including those on our website. So look out for those. We're right now going through the questions that we received through the portal. Even in our webinars, we've received a number of questions. So our teams are actually going through them now and identifying how to structure those for purposes of a frequently asked question, which is really important in terms of submission into the portal. So even if you're thinking about a question, it's just helpful for us to have it, because it gives us an idea of some of the things that you might be seeing on the ground, for which we can help in terms of the implementation as we go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. The next one is, how does ONC ensure that health IT vendors develop their products to not only meet the letter of the rule, but the spirit of it? Generally, it seems that vendors meet the standard without necessarily adding real value.
That one's probably me to take on. So no, I appreciate the question, and you know, that was one of the things that I think from a sentiment perspective led up to the feedback that Congress heard associated with the 21st Century Cures Act, and why we have, as part of our conditions of certification requirements, this focused on real world testing. And so that would be one thing I think we have an interest in ensuring is performed appropriately. We've given health IT developers all the tools and flexibility they need to design testing programs for their customer base, stakeholders, infrastructure in which they work. But that is another area now of oversight and accountability that we can apply from a certification program perspective, to make sure not only when, you know, a single product goes through the initial testing and certification process, but that instances as they get developed in the field are performing up to spec, both in terms of the letter of the law and the spirit. And again, you know, to plug the feedback portal as well, there's an opportunity to provide feedback to the certification program. We work directly with the certification bodies, and you know, as you are having experiences or concerns with health IT products that have been certified through our program, would encourage you to share that with us, and we'll either look to see if it's something relevant to our oversight and accountability, or if it's something that's best referred to a certification body.
Thank you very much. The next question is, do these standards incorporate guidelines for how and what data states should be used to track their healthcare workforce? If not, is the ONC aware of national standards for health workforce data?
Might need more information on that one in particular. You know, so when it comes to classifying different types of workforce members, you know, we do have, you know, occupational related kind of coding and information on the interoperability standards advisory. As a general matter, and Elise might be able to head nod or chime in too, you know, when it comes to employees of a particular healthcare provider or other company, that isn't necessarily data that is traditionally considered protected health information, and so that would not be in scope, you know, from an information blocking perspective, certainly not on the certification side.
Thank you. The next one, many times there are fees attached by EHR vendors to maintain connections that can sometimes prevent clinics who would otherwise share information. Is there any guidance around what is a reasonable charge for adding or maintaining connections?
So again, so we talked about this a little bit. I would start first with thinking about whether an agreement has been reached between the requester and the actor, in which case, you know, the fees and the licensing provisions would have been dealt with. In situations where that's not the case and you roll into the alternate manner scenario, then there are some considerations that we note around fees. We did not set any particular fees related to the product or accessing, exchanging, or using EHI. We wanted to allow the market to really define the appropriate price. But there are some things that I think you can think about. One is we do allow for reasonable profit. We do allow for the profits to occur, but we do want to make sure that they're reasonably related to the actor's costs for the type of access exchange and use of EHI at issue. The other important point there is objective and verifiable criteria. And I know I keep on saying objective, I know I keep on saying those phrases, but it's really important in terms of the rule. We want to make sure that where a fee is put in place, that it's based upon an objective and verifiable criteria, and it's not based upon, I have an affiliation with you elsewhere, so I'm going to share information with you, and I'm not going to share information with my competitor over here. So we do address fees in the rule generally, and those are some of the constraints that we put around it.
Thank you very much. And I believe that you guys have another engagement to get to, so I'm going to say thank you very much for that excellent presentation and all that information. And we're going to go ahead and switch over to our next presenter. We are very excited about this next one. Here we go. And this next presentation is Taking Interoperability to the Next Level by Dave Castle. For anyone just joining us right now, today's sessions are in the style of Ask Me Anything. Each set of presenters will provide some information on their topic to set the stage, and then the floor will be open for questions. Please note that you'll be using Zoom's Q&A function to send in your questions, and that you can send them at any time throughout the presentation. As a reminder, when you submit questions, please keep them short, clear, and professional. Any questions that are unprofessional or antagonistic will be dismissed by the moderators. Also, before submitting one of your own, check to see if someone else has submitted a similar question that you can upvote. This will help the topics that you care about rise to the top of the list. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to the presenter for this session, Dave Castle. Dave Castle has worked over 20 years in health information technology, creating a national reputation as an expert in health information exchange. As Executive Director of Care Quality, Dave is responsible for the Care Quality Interoperability Framework, which enables health data sharing across and among different types of networks. Under his leadership, the National Level Trusted Exchange Framework was first implemented in July 2016 and has rapidly grown to include more than 600,000 providers across more than 1,700 hospitals and 40,000 plus clinics, currently sharing more than 80 million documents a month. Dave holds a Master of Science in Economics from the University of Wisconsin and a Bachelor of Science in Economics from the University of Delaware. Dave, let's go ahead and get you started.
All right, and you should be seeing my title slide. Is that correct?
It looks great.
All right. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Sarah and the UHIN team for inviting me to be part of this forum today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I do have some slides that I'll present. My goal is not necessarily to PowerPoint at you. I think the more interactive the session is, the better. But I do have some ideas for how to frame the conversation around taking interoperability to the next level. And obviously that teaser title could lead a number of different directions, and I'll give you a little bit of insight with my slides here on where I'm thinking of that. But first off, as you no doubt heard from Sarah, I'm the Executive Director of Care Quality, and I'm not here to flog for Care Quality by any means, but just to briefly give you some context if you're not familiar with what we do, just so that you understand my perspective. Care Quality's role in the industry is to create a standardized national level interoperability framework that links data sharing networks together and ultimately creates a web of interconnected communities. And that likely sounds fairly abstract, but so UHIN, for example, is a data sharing network. It's part of the eHealth Exchange, probably part of some other networks and other contexts as well. And in general, there are lots of networks that are out there. Some are regionally based, some are vendor-based, some are organized around a particular commercial service offering. But whatever the case may be, these various networks exist, and Care Quality's role is to provide a framework that allows them to continue doing their good work while also connecting their members into a broader ecosystem of all the other participants. And you can think of it a little bit as being like the telecom industry has done with cell phone networks, where as a consumer, you buy a cell phone and you choose a service provider. But then at that point, you simply make phone calls and it works, and you don't have to worry about who the various service providers are that serve the people you're calling, because they have all behind the scenes connected to one another with a national level, even international framework. The details break down a little bit as you extend the analogy too far, but the concept is kind of the same. So as the provider organization or some other relevant stakeholder, you connect to one of what we call our implementers from a care quality context, one of these networks, and then the implementer allows you to connect into this broader ecosystem. So with that as context, I won't belabor this slide, just gives you a little bit of sense of who participates in care quality, who those implementers are, and who is live right now. But you didn't come here to hear about care quality, I'm sure. So with that context out of the way, let me switch gears here and talk about first of all, the state of interoperability, but really then get into what I think is the more interesting part, which is addressing how we can take all of this existing interoperability to the next level. So first of all, there is some good news, I think, and sometimes I think we're our own worst enemy in some ways in the interoperability world, where we always do want things to be better, and for good reason, because we shouldn't be satisfied with where we are. But at the same time, it is important to recognize that we aren't starting from nothing. There actually has, in fact, been progress made over the past couple of decades. And sometimes, depending on who you listen to, you may lose sight of that. So at least from my perspective, and I'm certainly interested in differing opinions here, but I would say that it's fair to claim that basic connectivity is widespread, that the overwhelming majority of providers, or at least those with EHRs, have access to basic document query or direct messaging capabilities, and most, I would say, have both. A significant percentage of providers have national connectivity. You know, they're connected into the eHealth Exchange, Commonwealth, SureScripts, and then by extension, most of those are in turn connected into care quality as well. The early returns on point-to-point HL7 FHIR-based exchange, I think, are very promising. I believe you'll be hearing from Viet Nguyen in a bit, and I actually don't know if he's necessarily wearing a FHIR hat today, but he certainly has plenty to say about FHIR and has been involved in a lot of that work, and there's a lot of promise to it. I know that UHIN is engaged in the patient-centered data home project for sending alerts. They're not alone in that, both in terms of the region in which UHIN participates and more broadly across the country. Those alerts are increasingly becoming available, and there's every reason to expect that they'll be more so as new expectations from CMS start to kick in. And then finally, on the good news front, I think this is less universal, but nonetheless, users are often able to reconcile outside medications, allergies, and problems into their local systems from information that they receive via an interoperability connection. So to summarize, I think it's fair to say that the pipes have been laid at a basic level, and there is something flowing through them, and sometimes it's drinkable water. You know, I think while that is perhaps in some ways seems like a low bar, I think at the same time it is important to recognize that we have made that progress. So as you can no doubt tell, and from everything that I'm saying, and also just from your own experience, none of this means that our interoperability mission has been accomplished. So I've picked up a few key elements here. I'm interested in others that folks have identified, but I think these really cover some of the elements that we still need to address at a national level and down to the regional and local levels as well. So first and foremost, patient matching remains inconsistent. And you can only do so much with interoperability if you can't actually figure out who the patient is that we're supposed to be talking about. Everything sort of breaks down if you can't solve that basic problem. The content that is exchanged, and that is certainly true of continuity of care documents, but I think it's true of other exchange paradigms as well. However it is that you receive the content, the clinical content that you receive is variable, to put it kindly, in its quality. And tightly intertwined with that observation, standardization of the content is also a work in progress. Also coupled with those other elements there, usability improvements are needed within systems. So the information gets to users, but is it actually useful by the time it gets there? And then finally, participation by non-providers does remain pretty spotty. I think in Utah, actually, you are perhaps ahead of the curve in payer participation in interoperable exchange. That is not necessarily the nationwide experience in my observation. And others, including consumers, once you get beyond consumers and payers, it really drops off. And there are others who would be interesting to get engaged in this whole interoperable ecosystem. But in any case, that participation remains spotty today. So how can we start trying to address these things? It may shock you, but I'm not necessarily going to solve all of these problems for you here on the call today. But I do have some ideas for how we can think about practical short-term steps and longer-term steps. So on the patient matching front, there are certainly some things that we can do in the short term that I think are readily achievable and are not rocket science from a technical standpoint. One of those is to standardize demographics. For example, there's been studies that show that using the USPS formatting for the address will have yield significant improvements in patient matching rates. Another element that I think we really aren't taking full advantage of is the amount of data that we often have. EHRs and other relevant systems often do collect things like email addresses, and they have mobile phone numbers, and many times they have past addresses, but we're not using those when we try to match patients via demographics across these interoperability connections with external partners. And then you can't just rely only on exact string matching. Despite everyone's best efforts, especially on fields like address and even on name, there can be some variations and nicknames and such things. But especially with address, which has a lot of power, but there are a lot of ways that extra spaces or different punctuation, different abbreviations, even with some standardized formatting, can still creep into the address field. So finding a way to avoid reliance on exact string matching is very important as well. All of that said, you know, this paradigm of sending you my demographics and hoping that you can have a wizard-like algorithm that somehow matches those up to the demographics on your side is only going to get us so far. At some point, there's going to be, we're going to approach an asymptote there, and there's only so much incremental improvement that we can get from significant investments, at least is my view. And that we can argue about exactly where that asymptote is in terms of the accuracy of patient matching, but it's probably somewhere around in the 85 to 95% range as far as what we can do with near perfection on patient matching patient demographics matching alone. So I do think, and as with several other things that I'll say here, this is easy to say and hard to do, but it does seem like in the long term, we need to change the paradigm that we're working on, that there's only so much we can do to improve patient matching by relying on demographics. Biometrics is certainly an interesting possibility to explore. There are some challenges there, especially as you start looking at using biometrics across different organizations. If you're not using the same platform, so the encoding, for example, of actually taking your fingerprint or your iris scan or whatever it may be, and encoding that into actual bits and bytes is a proprietary feature of the systems that do this. And so it doesn't necessarily yield something that you can compare in a standardized way with other systems. And I know that's a problem that folks are working on. I'm certainly not aware of any breakthroughs there. And so that's one limitation among others to relying on biometrics, but nonetheless, it seems like there is a strong possibility there. But in general, patient matching is certainly something that we need to watch. And overall, with all of these things that I'm talking about here today as elements that we need to take a look at, if we don't do the right thing, and if we rush forward and get enamored of cool new technologies in other areas, I've used the analogy before of having a really expensive and very impressive performance car built on top of a rusty shopping cart chassis. And it's all going to come crashing down on top of us and waste all of that investment in the other elements if we don't have some of these basic foundational things done correctly. So with that, let me pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments on patient matching specifically. Sarah, did we have anything in the queue?
We do have a question. It doesn't look like it is specific to patient matching, but if you're good with it, I'll go ahead and read it out anyway. And just as a reminder to attendees, you can send in your questions at any time. You can upvote the questions that are already in the Q&A section, and those will help prioritize those at the top of our list. So the question that we have in there already is, if it hasn't already, does Care Quality plan to implement the protocols from the Declaration of Taipei from the WMA regarding interoperability in biobanks and large healthcare data banks?
Well, I will freely confess that I have no idea what the Declaration of Taipei is. If you're able to put a little bit more there in the chat, but I apologize, I'm simply not familiar with that one, which I suppose is an answer that no, we don't have any current plans along those lines. That isn't to say that I'm not open to looking at what that particular deliverable is and where it might fit in.
Wonderful, thank you. And if the questioner does want to add additional information, please feel free to do that. Another question did just come in that is a little bit more specific to patient matching, and this one is, should there be a national MPI?
And was that M as in mama or N as in November?
M as in mama.
Okay. That is a fascinating question. I mean, I think establishing a national MPI in practice, first of all, has a variety of political and business challenges, but it also, at the end of the day, the way that would actually be done would be to take the existing systems and feed them into the national MPI. So you still have to solve this problem of patient matching, and then also, you know, as soon as that is done, you have new records. How do you then match the records against the national MPI? I feel like that's actually a case that demonstrates that principle I was talking about, where there comes a point where if the best we can do from a process standpoint or from an algorithm standpoint is various degrees of smarts around how patient demographics line up, that there'd be massive investments in a national MPI, and it would help, but would it help a lot, or would it help 1 to 2%, and would that actually be worth the money that was spent on it and the time and the opportunity cost? I'm a little skeptical of that being the solution. But it's a good question, and it certainly is something that we don't want to ignore as a potential possibility.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, no problem. Were there other questions?
That's it so far.
Okay. Let me sort of trying to keep half an eye on the time here as well. And I think we'll be fine for time. I just want to make sure that we don't get bogged down anywhere. So let's suppose we've solved patient matching, or at least taken steps, and we're doing as best we can. What's the next area that's going to trip us up? And that really, I think, is content quality and standardization. I've been in other conversations and on a panel once where someone had used and it may have actually been me that kicked it off, I don't remember. But we started talking about that laying the pipes analogy, and the conversation started to go down a path where everyone was talking about, well, we have these pipes, but the water flowing through them is dirty, and the dirty water became sort of the watchword of that particular session. And I think there's something to that. I hope that the pipes that I'm part of supporting are not just there to have dirty water flow around, but it's important to acknowledge that the content quality is not what we necessarily would ideally hope it would be. It's actually an area that Cura Quality, in collaboration with the Commonwealth Alliance, has done some longstanding work on. We have a set of recommendations that, frankly, are pretty basic. For example, that in the context of CCDA documents, that you should, in fact, support encounter summary documents if you are a system that has a concept of an encounter, which obviously most clinical systems do. So if you have outpatient visits, you should send summaries of those visits. If you have inpatient stays, you should send discharge summaries. And that's kind of the level that we're at as far as raising the minimum bar at a national level. There are a lot of systems that still, when queried for information, or to a certain extent, when sending information via direct messaging as well, will basically be able to send what I call a patient level document, meaning that the information is not necessarily specific to any encounter. It's going to have things like meds problems, allergies, immunizations, perhaps some results, probably some information on recent encounters, but at a pretty high summary level, not really getting into the details, and certainly not containing clinician notes, which we've heard time and again are essential to start adding into the content arsenal, making sure that those are being sent. So a little bit here to get back to explicitly what's on the slide, but one of the things that I think needs to be done is on expanding the use of consistent terminologies. Right now, they're relatively standardized around what I've abbreviated here as PAMI data: problems, allergies, meds, and immunizations. And I noted earlier that those are often, if not universally, able to be reconciled between systems. And I think meaningful use was a big part of why that is possible, where it is possible. But moving that on to enabling reconciliation of lab results, for example, would be hugely important. And certainly in the current context, COVID-19 results are particularly important for everyone to be able to garner however they can when sending interoperable transactions, especially since testing, is certainly done in contexts where it can be disconnected from the providers who need the information. So a provider might order a test. It ends up being done at the local hospital or at a drive-up facility, and it's difficult for the original provider to trace that back and actually get the information. Or for that matter, a patient gets a test, maybe hasn't even gotten the result back yet, but is presenting at an emergency room or just for care in general. Certainly being able to access any information on the result that may be out there in the ecosystem, if you will, would obviously be very helpful for those who are about to treat the patient in those contexts. And obviously, way beyond COVID-19, it's certainly top of mind right now and would have a high impact. But reconciliation of lab results in general would be very useful to have. And I apologize, I'm not sure how much background noise is coming through. I'm having a little bit of work done upstairs in my upstairs bathroom, and I told them to be as quiet as they could while demolishing my house, and they seem to generally be following directions. But I mentioned expanding support for documents, templates, and as we move forward, expanding support for FHIR resources, but doing so with coordination across the industry on key terminologies and metadata. And this is going to be a theme here through the rest of what I say on the slide, but it is very important. And again, this is another case of easy to say, but hard to do. Very important to strike the right balance between innovation and experimentation and getting new technologies out there so they can be adapted and improved upon and then adopted in a widespread way, with multi-stakeholder coordination to make sure that we're moving forward in a way that is relatively easy to clean up afterwards. You know, when you're doing a project, obviously you can do it in a chaotic way that leaves a bunch of tools laying around, and you know, the analogies start to get clumsy pretty quickly. But obviously there's a way that you can experiment and innovate, but do so with sort of a clear path forward on how you're going to align what you're doing with broader standards, that you're not striking out without thinking about standardized terminologies for key elements of the clinical content that you're exchanging. So all of that is hugely important. And that leads into the longer term suggestion that I have here, and that is in implementing HL7 FHIR, we shouldn't be repeating past history. And I know this is something that I'm certainly not the only one to make this observation. And I do see there being an effort to not repeat past history in terms of allowing too much optionality. At the same time, I think that there is a cultural tendency that we need to fight against in health IT interoperability, where we are going too far towards that enabling innovation and experimentation, and we're not doing enough on the coordination and standardization front. And I know that oftentimes as you're in standards development, and we do it for care quality, and we're not a standards organization, but at the same time as we're setting policies and developing our implementation guides, we are always cognizant of the fact that we don't want to have unintended consequences. We don't want to rule out cool and innovative things that we hadn't necessarily thought of. But at the same time, again, easy to say, hard to do. You have to strike the balance there and ensure that you are not providing too much optionality, that you're actually setting a standard. And we just need to continue to remain cognizant of that as we're implementing FHIR. So let me pause there. I think I may have seen another question or two come in.
Yes, there was actually additional information added to the question earlier about the Taipei Declaration. And the questioner says specifically, in the Taipei Declaration adopted in 2016 by the World Medical Association, my concern is with consistent access to biobank information, especially where informed consent for information access can feasibly be changed at any time by the donor.
Well, I think that there may be, at least from the care quality standpoint, a question of applicability there, because there isn't really any concept of a biobank that we would interact with. I don't know if there's anything that UHIN does along those lines. If anyone on the line from UHIN could comment from that perspective. But for what it's worth, I think from the care quality perspective, I will look into that just to make sure I'm educated about it. But I think it may be a bit of a different parallel related, but not actually directly intertwined path from what we're doing on the care quality side.
And then just as you started answering, additional context came in the form of a comment that says this policy could feasibly impact implementation of biometrics in interoperability in the US and abroad.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And yeah, there are a number of challenges. I mentioned one of them with the proprietary way that folks implement the translation of a particular biometric, well, metric, I suppose, with a into a numeric value of some sort, or a string value of some sort, and those codes not being necessarily interoperable. Certainly, as soon as you get into using what is biological data, there are certainly considerations there of patient consent as well that absolutely are important.
Thank you. And then we did have another question come in that says, how should standards at the local level interact with the national level standards, or vice versa?
I would say, generally speaking, that standards at the local level should be avoided, and that national level standards should be used. Now, that said, again, there is always a balance there, and at the local level, there can be innovation and experimentation, and maybe you're doing something that really is novel, or at least is sufficiently novel that there isn't a decided upon national standard. In such a case, what I would recommend is working in conjunction with national efforts of some sorts, whether that's actually HL7 or some other ANSI-accredited standards body, but make sure that folks are aware of what you're doing, so that what you're doing at the local level could actually then feed into becoming a national level standard. Either way, it's important for everybody to be talking, so that you don't have someone at the local level striking out when there actually is a national standard that should be used. Or at the same time, you don't have somebody at the local level in Utah striking out, somebody at the local level in Pennsylvania, going forward on a very similar path, and somebody in Florida doing, again, very similar, maybe slightly different. Nobody's talking to each other, and they all end up doing very different things that later have to be reconciled. I know I didn't do a very good job of talking about doing projects in a way that's messy versus a way that is easy to clean up afterwards. But that's sort of what I was getting at. That staying in communication, being able to take what you're doing and as easily as possible tie it back into a national effort, I think is what we should be striving to do.
Thank you very much. That takes care of the questions so far. So if you have more content, looks like you're good to go.
All right. That sounds good. So the next area that I had flagged was usability improvements. And this is something that we really see in care quality, and it can actually be pretty frustrating, because at the level that we're at, working at this very high sort of several layers removed from the direct provider experience, there's only so much we can do about any particular EHR vendor's content or EHR vendor's user interface, or for that matter, anybody else's user interface. But the more that we tie content quality and standardization together and do a good job of improving those, we can then more feasibly improve the user experience as well. The content efforts are, as I say here, necessary but not sufficient. There is still work that needs to be done by UI developers. But in the absence of content improvements, you have this, and I use the example here of playing whack-a-mole with these pairwise issues across different partners. And just to give a real-world example of that, there was a collaboration between Epic and Cerner, believe it or not, in California in particular, where they would, when a user at a Cerner site would report, hey, in the Cerner user interface, we're seeing XYZ when we get these documents from Epic. And the Epic site would say something similar about the content that they were getting from Cerner. Cerner and Epic would look at that, and then they decide first, oh, okay, internally there's something we need to do here. But oftentimes it would be way down in the details of the how Cerner was identifying a document type, or how in the document metadata that they were sharing, Epic was tagging a particular type of encounter. All of these different things were being worked out between Epic and Cerner, and there was oftentimes one or the other party would have to do development, usually not rocket science, but nonetheless still some development that would then need to go through all those QA processes and release processes, and then be disseminated out to their customer bases and actually installed in production. And all of that takes time, as no doubt you all know. And that's just Epic and Cerner. If you think about every pairwise connection between any partners, that's what we're looking at in the absence of really standardizing the content. So when I talk about the sort of the next level of content standardization, I guess there's multiple next levels there. One is just the basic things like having more consistent use of more varied CCDA templates. But how we represent the metadata, what does a particular encounter type look like when you describe it in these documents? How do you actually have a broad set of understandable, mutually understandable terms that describe the content, let alone the content itself? That's not even getting to the level of making sure that the lab results can be understood. That's just saying we understand that we're all talking about lab results here. So you need to have that first before you can say, oh, okay, well, this one's a white blood cell count. So in any case, these usability issues are certainly very real. We hear about them all the time. And I think, as a general rule, everyone is motivated to address them, but there's a prerequisite there to really addressing them in the most efficient and most effective way, and that is doing what we had talked about on the previous slide around standardizing content and terminologies. But that one was a little quicker, but any questions there?
No new questions have come into the chat yet, so if you want to keep going, you're free to do so.
All right, sounds good. So one last major topic area that I had highlighted in terms of getting us to the next level, and that is participation by non-providers. Right now, the overwhelming majority of what we broadly call interoperability, whether that's the type of things that are enabled by care quality, whether that's FHIR-based exchange. It's a little less true of FHIR-based exchange, but still true to a large extent, I think, and certainly with direct messaging as well. While all of those interoperable capabilities are very much envisioned to be useful across many different stakeholders and many different use cases, by and large, there is a provider-to-provider focus in many cases. And that isn't to say that we couldn't reuse this functionality and in fact get a lot of efficiency and greater access to data by reusing some of these capabilities. So in the short term, I think there are a few things we can do here. And one would be to ensure that we have content that is tailored to payer needs in particular, that can be delivered using existing tools. You know, I know it's easy for me to say here that providers should be sharing information with payers and vice versa. There's a great deal of history there. But at the same time, you know, there's, whether we like it or not, there would definitely be efficiency gains and some overall costs to the health system benefits of getting payers better information. Then perhaps there's a broader policy question of how we ensure that any such gains are actually realized by society as a whole and not simply the payer. And I realize that's the rub for many provider organizations. But as we look towards development of HL7 FHIR, and I know that this is certainly being done by FHIR accelerators, which is a great thing, but we always need to be cognizant of keeping generalized exchange partners in mind and not focus on particularly making sure that things work in a provider-to-provider context. In the longer term, I think so right now there's actually, to back up a little bit, I mentioned that FHIR is perhaps a little bit of an exception on the provider-centric element. FHIR-based exchange is envisioned to be used in a wide variety of settings, but one where it actually has already seen some non-trivial adoption is on the consumer access front. So using FHIR to allow patients and their caregivers, you know, the HIPAA term is escaping me for some reason, authorized representatives, are able to access information today. And I think we're going to see that type of capability continue to develop in its current form, and that'll be a good thing. So however, in the longer term, I do think that a current dependency that ecosystem, to call it that, tends to have on relying on separate user logins for each system is not going to really meet our needs in the long term. So we're going to somehow need to free consumer access from that dependence on separate login accounts for each system. And I know that our friends over at the Karen Alliance and others are working on doing exactly that. And that is going to be necessary in the long term. And, you know, some sort of privacy law modernization may be helpful as well. You know, that's probably coming. Whether it deserves the label modernization is an open question, but probably it will. And whether that goes in a direction that really advances the ball not only for privacy, but also ensures that appropriate access to information with patient consent it can happen easily, will be on all of us as players who are providing feedback on proposed rules and such as that privacy law modernization effort moves forward in Congress, which I do expect here. Excuse me, over the next couple of years. All right. So that was the last of the particular areas that I called out. I think we do have just a few minutes left if there were any last questions that had come in.
And then I know everyone's heard this a couple times, but just in case there's some new people attending, you can find your Q&A button at the bottom and center of your screen. It should have a little chat bubble icon there. Enter any questions that you have, and we'll get those over to Dave. And as he said, we have just a couple of minutes to get those in. We do have one question that just came in. Any comments regarding RCEs and QHINs?
Well, care quality is a subrecipient actually of the Sequoia Project's RCE cooperative agreement, which is a complicated way of saying that conceptually we're a subcontractor to the Sequoia Project, and specifically Care Equality is primarily responsible for developing the UHIN technical framework as part of that arrangement. It was a very open-ended question in terms of commenting on it. I think it'll be interesting to see the direction that the TEFCA goes in. To the extent that that I have any influence, I'm certainly trying to keep in mind all of these points that I've raised today. There is a possibility that what the TEFCA and the UHIN exchange ecosystem would do is just create an even larger forum for some of these weaknesses, I'll say, to play out. So we do need to make sure, again, to circle back to my analogy of the really expensive performance car built on a shopping cart. We need to make sure that we are continuing to keep all of these areas for improvement in mind as we work on that TEFCA ecosystem.
Thank you very much. And that basically brings us to time. So I'm going to go ahead and close us out of questions. Thank you so much, Dave, for doing this presentation for us. And we hope that you'll be able to join us at some future events and keep us informed on all of these critical things coming forward.
I hope so as well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Next, we have a short break until 1:15 p.m. And at that point, at 1:15 p.m., that is Mountain Standard Time, or Mountain Daylight Time, we will resume presentations with a discussion of implementing the CMS interoperability rules by Viet Nguyen, followed by our panel on Utah's healthcare landscape after the pandemic. The rest of the program will be on the same webinar connection as the first half, so we recommend keeping your computer connected during the break. Thank you, and we'll see you at 1:15. Hello, and welcome back to the UHIN Annual Forum. We're about to get started with the session Implementing the CMS Interoperability Rules with DaVinci by Viet Nguyen. For anyone new, today's sessions are in the style of Ask Me Anything. Each set of presenters provides some information on their topic to set the stage, and then the floor will be open for questions. Please note that you'll be using Zoom's Q&A function to send in your questions and that you can send them at any time throughout the presentation. As a reminder, when you submit questions, please keep them short, clear, and professional. Any questions that are unprofessional or antagonistic will be dismissed by the moderators. Also, before submitting one of your own, check to see if someone else has submitted a similar question that you could upvote. This will help the topics you care about rise to the top of the list. At this point, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Viet Nguyen. Dr. Nguyen is an internist, pediatrician, clinical informaticist, and consultant to government and commercial organizations in developing interoperable workflows and technologies. He received his MD at the University of Utah, where he also did fellowship training in medical informatics. He has over 15 years of experience in health IT, focused on interoperability standards and product development. Formerly the CMIO for Lockheed Martin and Leidos Corporation, Dr. Nguyen is a nationally recognized fire educator, an HL7 board member, a Fire Foundation board member, chief medical officer for Logica, and technical director for the HL7 DaVinci project. And we're very pleased to welcome him today. Dr. Nguyen, I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to you.
Thank you very much. All right, let's make sure you can see my screen. Oh, sorry, just lost my screen sharing options here.
Oh, you're all right. We'll get there.
All righty. Thank you. All righty. Let me know that you can see my slides in the full screen.
Yes, they just loaded and they're looking good.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this annual forum. My goal here in this discussion is to give you a little bit of background on the Da Vinci project and how the work that we've done over the past couple of years relates to the CMS and ONC interoperability rules. So the Da Vinci project is a collaborative formed under HL7 by a number of providers, payers, EHRs, as well as vendors to address value-based care and fee-for-service interoperability issues and leverage the adoption of FHIR to improve on workflow, information exchange, and ultimately patient care. So as you can see, we have a large number of members who are actively participating in about 20 hours worth of calls a week between our use case calls and the HL7 calls. We'd like to share this antitrust policy. So we follow HL7's antitrust policy that is a member of ANSI. And so this is important because we remind folks that the work we do is for the good of the community and the patients, and that we avoid any activities that might be considered proprietary or anti-competitive. So Da Vinci was formed just a little more than 2 years ago, following the HIMSS meeting in 2017. And when we initially started the project, we thought we'd have a dozen members or so, and we'd do 1 or 2 use cases a year. But since then, we have over 35 members, and we have done about 15 use cases. We really accelerated things last year following the release of the proposed rules, and we pivoted and really accelerated our work to try to address some of the topics that were initially brought up in the proposed rule and now are in the final rule. And the theme for us this year is really to put things into implementation to meet the rules as well as the other areas that Da Vinci has been working on. So implementation is a big goal of what we're doing this year. So this is a list of all of our current use cases and the areas that we are working on. And so we have projects working on quality improvement, working with groups like NCQA and CMS on quality measures. We have a large amount of providers and payers working on coverage and burden reduction issues around prior auth. And then we have a number of use cases directed at exchanging information, both between payers and providers, but also with patients. The use cases that are outlined in red are the ones that align with the ONC and CMS rules. This is another view of our use cases, and we use a dial to kind of give the audience a sense of where they are in their level of maturity. The dark gray dials are actually implementation guides that are published, which means that they can be picked up and implemented, and then we take that feedback to improve these implementation guides. The other lighter gray use cases are balloted and are undergoing ballot reconciliation and will be published, we expect, within the next few months. And then we have a handful of use cases that we anticipate will be started or at least initiated during this year. So the Da Vinci project is actually one of a number of projects which are called HL7 FHIR accelerators. And the reason they're accelerators is that they're accelerated by the resources, both in-kind and financial resources, by member organizations to do the work that has traditionally been volunteer work in HL7. So we focus on payer, provider, and patient data exchange, but we also leverage work that's been done by the Argonaut project that's reflected in the US Core FHIR resources, as well as partner closely with the folks at the Karen Alliance working on patient to payer or patient to provider information exchange. And there are a number of other FHIR accelerators that are focused on social determinants of health called Gravity, and another one that's about to kick off called Vulcan, which looks at regulated research in pharma. And we work in collaboration with the Fire at Scale Task Force, which is called, acronym is FAST, that's convened by ONC, which looks at all the issues around scaling. So how do we take FIRE, which is primarily focused on point-to-point interoperability, but address issues such as finding endpoints for payers and providers, and doing security and addressing conformance, issues like that. So we work in conjunction with them in order to roll out FIRE, both as use cases and as the infrastructure across the whole IT ecosystem. So what we do in DaVinci is really create these implementation guides, and the way to think of them are, they are a kind of recipe or standard operating procedure for you to have consistent set of information models and APIs to exchange data for a given situation. The examples are the ones in those use cases, such as burden reduction, quality measure exchange, or payer-to-payer data exchange. So the next set of slides, I want to acknowledge and thank United Healthcare that sponsored work by Bob Dieterle, who has been working in DaVinci since the beginning to evaluate the interoperability rule from CMS and ONC and provide a summary. And so they funded that work and allowed him to share that work with the DaVinci and the broader community. So this is a summary of his findings. And I will caveat this, that I'm not a policy expert. I'm more on the technical clinical side. So I'm going to give a high level view. CMS and ONC are looking for feedback from the community, and both have email addresses for directed questions that they will then collate and provide feedback through their FAQs and other forums to the broader community. So the CMS interoperability rule is really focused on payer organizations, from Medicare Advantage organizations, Medicaid, CHIP fee-for-service, and qualified federal plans. It also has some caveats that also affect providers. And CMS rules and the ONC rules come together because the CMS rules really reference the rules from ONC, which define the APIs and security protocols and the data that's being exchanged. And for providers, it focuses on the hospitals and psychiatric hospitals and critical access hospitals that participate under the conditions of participation. And their role here is to exchange admission, discharge, and transfer notifications from the location to the care team. So the information that needs to be shared is quite a large amount. For payers, it's going to be claims information, both adjudicated claims as well as remittances, encounter data, the data that was mentioned by Steve Posnack in the earlier presentation around the US core data for interoperability. It also includes provider directories, pharmacy data, and clinical information via FIRE APIs. So it's really important, I think Steve mentioned this, but I'll reiterate it, is that the US CDI provides a large list of data classes, and within the classes are data domains. So a class might be demographics or patient data, and a specific data element might be the address or the phone number. And so many of the data classes and elements are represented in FIRE, but not necessarily everything. And then there are also classes that are represented by CDA as well. So the data, DaVinci has focused a lot on the information payers have needed to share with FIRE. And so we are looking here at the data that they need to send. So it's information that they receive from other payers. And one of the questions that has come up in the past is, well, if I don't get it in FIRE, how do I give it to you in FIRE? But one of the general notions is that if you're asked to send the data along in the format you're given the data. So there's not necessarily a need to transform it into FIRE, though that would be preferable because it becomes more computable. One issue that we did address is that this notion that covered payers that receive data from previous payers for a current enrollee and their prior 5 years of data. So if I need a timeline to show you this, but a payer has to maintain that 5 years going back, and then if they're asked for that data, they have to send it that 5 years back data. So if there are different scenarios that if a payer has a member for 10 years, you would need to go back to 2016 if the patient changes to a new payer in 2030. So that is an important consideration for payers. For hospitals, there's a provision around providing notifications, ADT notifications about when patients are admitted, discharged, or transferred. And these notifications need to be sent to care teams, the care team members. This is primarily done today in ADT messages using HL7 v2.5 plus. And it was this recognition that FHIR wasn't quite there yet. And so the method of exchange is not restricted only to version 2, but in the future, we think we can do FHIR as well to meet this notification requirement. This is an infographic provided by CMS before they did their announcement around enforcement discretion, but just reflects the previous implementation requirement dates. And there is an updated version of this. I just wasn't able to get it in time to put it into this presentation. So in terms of the applicable dates for implementing the requirements, there is a patient data access API that was going to be implemented January 1st, 2021 with an enforcement discretion of 6 months, a provider directory and payer directory. The provider directory enforcement discretion is for additional 6 months. The payer-to-payer data exchange is not set until January 2022. There are some additional requirements around reporting around information blocking and digital contact information, finding endpoints for payers. And then the admission, discharge, and transfer event notification was initially for January, or I think it was actually 6 months from publication in the register, Federal Register. But they're going to set the application implementation date for April of 2021. So in combination with the CMS rules is really the ONC rules that were discussed earlier. But a little more specifically for this discussion are a number of technical standards. And these are technical standards that we apply in DaVinci in our implementation guides. So first and foremost would be the FHIR standard, the base FHIR standard. And so we are now on a published version of 4.0.1. And that's readily available at the hl7.org/FHIR website. We use the SMART on FHIR application launch framework. We use OpenID for identification and authorization. And then we leverage the content vocabulary standards from the US CDI. And many of those are represented in FHIR by the US core resources, which are profiles or data models for a number of data concepts such as patient, provider, organization, allergies. And so here are a number of them where the US CDI applies in terms of transitions of care, transferring information between providers and patients. Many of you and many in Utah actually already support this through the Argonaut profiles. But this is just a short list of some of the data classes and elements that are in the US CDI, and most of them are represented by these FHIR US core profiles. So this was a diagram we created when the NPRM was announced to try to reflect where the work that we are doing in DaVinci is reflected in data exchange between payers, providers, and patients. So the circled use cases are where we see a direct alignment between the work we've done in responding to what we saw in the NPRM and what is in the final rule. So what I'm going to do next is, actually, I'll pause here and see if there are any questions before I jump to some of these areas.
Yes, there was one question that came in, which was, where can we find the published implementation guides and use cases?
Sure. Actually, they are published via the HL7 Fire standards website, and I'll provide a link and show you a quick view of how you can find it on with all of our implementation guides. If you go to confluence.hl7.org, HL7's Confluence site, DaVinci uses that site extensively to document our work, our conversations, and we have a dashboard that you can see all of our implementation guides, where they are in their maturity, links to both the implementation guide as well as links to any of the HL7 artifacts related to the guide, and links to our use case discussions. So we try very much to make our information readily available to the community, and to the extent possible, make it easily identifiable, searchable, and usable. So I'll give you a preview of that towards the end of the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. That's the only question so far, so we'll just keep collecting them for you as you go along.
Great, thank you. So the first requirement from the final rule is around a patient access API. And that applies to the payers listed on the left. And the rule is around providing a secure, standards-based FHIR API that allows patients to access claims information, cost information, and a subset of their clinical information using a third-party application where they can provide member authorization. So in this diagram, it fits here where the patient is in the center of an exchange using a consumer application, and they provide this authorization to their payer to share that information with that consumer application. And the information that would be made available would be around the clinical data in the US CDI, claims data, as well as formulary and directory data that's based on their plan. As I noted in the diagram with the other FHIR accelerators, the Karen Alliance is really focused on that payer to patient data exchange around the claims data today. Yeah, may have heard of the Blue Button Initiative, and how that allows patients to see a version of their explanation of benefits. And so that's how we envision, at least for today, claims information would be shared by payers. Over time, as payers get clinical information in the form of FHIR, then we expect that patients would be able to get that information as well via these third-party applications. So the first of the DaVinci implementation guides that I want to note is the DaVinci Payer Data Exchange, which is an umbrella implementation guide that defines how payers would use the US core data for interoperability, as well as CDA, to share this information with patients, much like what's been done with the Argonaut project and the Apple Health Kit, and connecting with a number of the major EHRs to get data. I know in Utah, both the university as well as Intermountain Healthcare, and I'm sure other providers in the community have this available to patients. And we expect that we would have a similar approach for patients to get this data from payers, which is really great because any given patient, especially if they have complex medical problems, may be seeing more than one provider. And so when we actually started this implementation guide, we were actually focused on how would we use this information that payers have to help providers as well. So if you switch out that third-party application to a provider EHR, we actually have some good demonstrations of how providers can request information from payers and get this information for direct patient care. And the idea here is then the patient and the provider would have a full breadth of information for clinical decision making, and reduce that time that we deal with today around information requests in order to make clear clinical decisions around diagnosis and treatment. So I think this is going to be a boon for patients, especially in light of the situation with COVID-19. We recognize that patients really need to have this information. So as you can see in this diagram, there's both FHIR-based clinical data as well as claims-based data. And we recognize that claims-based data doesn't have a lot of fidelity, or not fidelity isn't the right word. It doesn't have a lot of depth of information. It may have dates of service, it may have a diagnosis, but doesn't always have details. And over time, we believe that we will be able to enhance the claim information with the clinical information that payers are also receiving from providers. So the benefits of the PDEX is that it really does create this full picture of all the patient's activities that the payer knows, because they are providing payment for these services, but any one provider may not know because patients are receiving care outside their facility. And so having patients have this information, having providers have a full breadth of information, it really should improve care and reduce the delays in clinical decision making. So the next implementation guide is also under the Payer Data Exchange, or PDEX, but we call it the Provider Directory API, or the Plan Network. And it applies to the payers that were listed before, and planned implementation in January with enforcement discretion during the first 6 months. The idea here with the provider directory is that using a third-party application, the patient or any authorized entity could look up a payer's provider directory based on the patient's plan and coverage. That's really useful for an established patient, because then they can be able to see who's in network very easily, make sure that when they get referrals or when they establish care with a new provider, that provider's in network. But since it's by a standard API, a FHIR API, this same API could be implemented inside the EHR. So if a provider wanted to make a referral, they could use the same APIs to find a provider that's in the patient's network based on their coverage. So we think this is a very useful approach for using FHIR, and we actually have reference implementations along with implementation guides for this one as well. And I'll show the link for how do you get to the reference implementations as well towards the end of the presentation. But with the provider directory, we think it's a useful way of showing the provider information based on the plan in a standard API, much like what we see today with travel. I use the travel metaphor quite a bit. Using these standard APIs really makes it easy to find information across multiple similar entities. So the third implementation guide around patient data access is our PDEX formulary implementation guide. So the formulary domain, there's a crossover between what's been done by NCP, PDP, and others developing standards, and the work in FHIR, and there's actually some really good collaborative work. But the idea here was to provide a similar API using FHIR for patients and providers to look up a patient's formulary. So to understand what medications are on formulary, if that medication requires step therapy, and as well the cost to the patient. I think for providers, this would be really useful, and sometimes already available in some EHRs, where you can look up and find out if the medication you're about to prescribe is on formulary or not, and whether it needs step therapy. But that's not always available to patients. So the idea here is that the patient can authorize a lookup of the same formulary information via an API, or if they just provide a plan without any personally identifiable information, an app could also look up the same formulary based on the plan. So here's just another view of that exchange using FHIR. And with this formulary IG, we hope that patients can use these APIs to not only for established patients just determine if maybe their medication, they might have a less expensive alternative, or what the cost would be if they had to start on a new medication. Since it would be an open API, could be used by applications to compare the formulary coverage from one plan to another within the same payer or across payers if patients were shopping and wanting to know whether or not a new payer or potential new payer would cover their medications. So it improves on this transparency of information so that patients and providers can make better informed decisions. So I'll pause there for a second to see if there are any questions around the patient access API.
Thank you. We actually haven't had any questions quite yet, but let's give it just a second in case people are still processing that last bit. For attendees, just a quick reminder, and for anyone who's new, you can find your Q&A button at the bottom and center of your screen. Go ahead and send in your questions throughout, and as you can see, Viet is pausing at intervals so that we can get those answered.
I think this patient access API is really a good example of how we're moving towards better patient engagement, and patients having information allows them to be more engaged in their care, which as a provider, I think is a good thing, so that I can help advise them and they have information that they can use in the decision making. So let's move on. The next set of slides is around the payer-to-payer data exchange. And the idea here is that this applies to CMS regulated payers, and it would be for the clinical data specified under the US Core Data for Interoperability version 1. And it would allow patients to request their clinical data that the payer has when they move from one payer to another payer. So graphically, it would be this exchange when the patient moves. So it reflects not only the clinical data, but would also be reflected by exchanging data for continuity of treatment, which is something I'll address shortly. So the idea here is similar to that previous picture that you saw in PDEX. A new payer can request information from the old payer using the member's authorization. And the way we envision this in workflow is that when a patient signs up for a new plan, they would hopefully have the information necessary to identify their previous payer and any identifiers such as a plan, subscriber ID, and if they have portal access, that type of information to allow the new payer to make a FHIR-based request using that authorization to the historical payer. Now, we recognize that patients don't always have that information handy, and one of the things that we are working on in this implementation guide or an update is around member matching. I know that Dave talked about it earlier today and how important that is in making sure that we have the right patient and matching them with their correct data. But given this authorization, that historical payer would collect information going back at least 5 years about the patient, and be able to send that to the new payer and be able to make that available again to the patient. So where this is really helpful is that there are always going to be issues around coverage and coordination of care. So it's important when a new payer, when a patient joins with a new payer, if they have chronic conditions, we want to make sure that they continue to receive care for those conditions, and that the information needed to authorize or provide coverage for that care is continued. I know it's a significant issue for providers and patients today when patients switch plans, because it often requires a redo of all the prior authorization that was done with the previous plan. So along with that PDEX for payer to payer, we created another implementation guide called Payer Coverage Decision Exchange. And the idea here is that when the patient, again, enrolls in a new plan, they authorize the new payer to get information from the historical payer, but that information actually is really focused on current treatments, not just all the historical clinical data. And where this is important is that a patient may be actively being treated for a chronic condition or an active acute condition. And if you think there's something, a good example might be a rheumatoid drug that with their previous payer had to get authorization, we want to send over the information that the first payer had to make that authorization, so that the new payer has that information and can then use that information to do their adjudication. We recognize that a number of payers use proprietary services to do utilization management. And so they could use, if they're using the same algorithm to provide coverage determination, then that information could be put into that algorithm and hopefully smooth the process of getting the treatment continued, authorized and continued, instead of asking the patient to submit a bunch of forms and information, asking the provider to submit forms and information. The new payer has the information they need to continue the coverage of that medication or treatment. So I think that is actually in the theme of burden reduction that all providers are concerned about, as well as payers. This will go a long way to helping share that information and kind of reduce that paperwork burden on providers. So again, some of the benefits that we really focus on these current active treatments and minimizing the need for submitting documentation again. And of course, we want to reduce the risk of any interruption in the care of the patient and the treatments that they're receiving. So I'll pause there for any questions on payer-to-payer data exchange.
For sure. And we actually do have some questions coming in. The first one is, how do you see UHIN facilitating these regulations? And if I may, I'd actually like to hear if you have ideas about how other types of organizations would also help facilitate these regulations from our own places in the industry.
Yeah, so UHIN plays an important role in the health IT ecosystem, and we have organizations that do that as well in the general theme of deployment organizations. And depending on the role of UHIN, both as a clearinghouse as well as an HIE, they I think will play an important role in providing directories. So they can both be a warehouse of this information and provide the services for the payers potentially, or they can be directories to the information for the payers. They can also probably support the workflow aspects, because the notion of this next topic of admissions, discharges, and transfers is the notification goes to someone on a care team. Well, how do you know who's on the care team? Often the payers do, because they set it up based on the claims that they've received, but often HIEs know because they establish these roles on behalf of or these lists on behalf of patients and providers. So I think UHIN can play a role in many different areas of this, in both providing a common place for the APIs or endpoints for providers to expose their data, housing the information for their data, as well as being a type of routing service to make sure that the request is going to the right recipient and the information that is returned gets returned in a secure way.
Thank you. The next question is, what are the incentives or disincentives for not following the regulations? Are there any information blocking disincentives built in?
I'm going to have to defer that question to a policy expert. I know that there are likely to be, fines and other consequences, but I'm probably not the best person to speak to them.
That's fair enough. Thank you. The next question is, so this is for the CMS governed plans to share information with all other types of plans, like commercial?
Well, the plans that are covered are the Medicare Advantage plans, the qualified health plans under the marketplace. So it's not all commercial to commercial, but I think there's a reasonable recognition that many of the larger commercial plans, when they make this available through their Medicare Advantage or through their marketplace plans, it's not a huge leap to think that they couldn't make this available through their commercial plans as well.
All right. And then the last one we've got for right now is, what is your perspective on data ownership? Does any of the exchange of data shift that ownership? Does it allow modification of retention rules? Ironically, the management of data can be a burden to health systems.
Yeah, I think that retention rule for the payers is now this 5 years look back. So I think that does have implications for payers. Now, in terms of ownership, I think it can be a bit of a thorny issue. My opinion would be that we as the provider, the payer, and the rest of the health IT ecosystems are stewards of patients' data. And I think what these rules kind of reflect is that the patients have a role in getting that data, managing that data, and using it however they feel is appropriate for them, but that we want to make it available through secure and appropriate channels.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got for the moment.
All righty. So the final area I want to discuss is the admission, discharge, and transfer event notifications. Again, this rule applies to hospitals, psychiatric hospitals, and critical access hospitals under the conditions of participation. And the plan was to have them send notifications of the patient's admissions, discharges, and transfers from to another facility or within their facility. And implementation deadline is April of 2021. And so I think there's a recognition and a response from the community, and we heard it in Da Vinci that we really wanted to do a FHIR approach to this, and we have a FHIR messaging approach to this in our implementation guides, but we recognize that folks or organizations do this pretty effectively today using HL7 V2. And so I'm going to introduce this implementation guide with the caveat that we think that the way this will be done in FHIR is through an evolution of one of the FHIR resources called subscription. And the idea with subscription, like any subscription, is that you subscribe to an event, whether that be an admission, discharge, or transfer, or potentially for, say, public health, an event of a positive test for a reportable disease. And an entity can subscribe to that event, and when they subscribe to that event and it occurs, they get a notification. And however they can deal with the notification however they want, but this allows them to to provide a trigger for these kind of notifications that's probably more flexible ultimately than the way we have to manage routing tables for sending V2 messages and ADT messages. So we built an implementation guide to really focus on the notifications from the admitting or discharge transfer provider organization to another provider in the community or to the payer. And this could be done either directly or through an HIE. And ultimately, we set it up as a FHIR messaging push, but ultimately, as I mentioned, we want to use a subscription approach. And of course, the benefits here for providers is knowing that your patient was admitted in case there is important information that providers can share with the admitting physician or team to make sure that they have a complete information on the patient, as well as when the patient gets discharged or transferred, that primary care or other care team provider knows. So I think I'm running up on time. This is a list of our implementation guides. So I'll quickly go through the rest of these. We have a ton of resources for folks who are interested in not only the standards development, but on implementation. We participate in connectathons, and we have our own connectathons in DaVinci. This is a screenshot of our implementation guide dashboard. So on the left are the different focus areas, and you can sort it by focus area, by IG, find out what information has been gathered on the use case, as well as links to the validated implementation guide, or ultimately the published guide, and a sense of where we are. So we invite folks to find us on the confluence.hl7.org. There's a link to DaVinci on the right-hand side. Come join us on calls and really help us to implement these guides and really demonstrate how they work so that we can improve them over time and get them to a normative state that meets the needs of the community. So I'll pause there, just a little summary, and I'm pretty confident we'll be able to make these slides available soon to UHIN and this community.
Wonderful, thank you. And we do have a new question waiting for you, which is, what are some of the database technologies that early adopters have used for warehousing fire messages? Are there any that play better compared to others in developing the overall ecosystem?
Well, we have both SQL and non-SQL approaches to this. I think it's hard to say one plays better than others, other than recognizing that most of the messages that are sent around are primarily in XML or JSON. JSON seems to be the dominant way of sending fire resources. So my personal preference, I think NoSQL databases work well, but you can do SQL and very effectively. So we have organizations that have taken these reference implementations like the Happy Fire Server and scaled them to enterprise level. And I believe they use a relational model. So it really depends on your own architecture and how you, I'll call it, extend your current functionalities to support fire, and then look at areas where fire can meet kind of greenfield opportunities for your organization. So.
All right, and that brings us exactly to time. So thank you very much, Viet, for your time and expertise on this. We're extremely happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for the time of the audience.
Absolutely. All right, and at this point, I'd like to go ahead and have us shift gears to our last session of the day. This last session is a panel on Utah's healthcare landscape after the pandemic. Now, our panelists represent leaders from a variety of areas in and around healthcare, and 3 of them have served on Utah's coronavirus task force. The panel session will include some prepared questions, as well as live questions from attendees. Please note that you'll be using Zoom's Q&A function to send in your questions, and you can send them in at any time. When you type in a question, please let us know if the question is for a specific panelist or for everyone. As a reminder, when you submit questions, please keep them short, clear, and professional. Any questions that are unprofessional or antagonistic will be dismissed by the moderators. Also, before submitting one of your own, check to see if someone else has submitted a similar question that you could upvote. This will help the topics you care about rise to the top of the list. As we introduce each panelist, we'll give them a minute to add information about their background and expertise that might help guide your questions. Once that's done, we'll hand the time to the moderator for our panel. Starting with our introductions. The first one is Lieutenant Governor Spencer J. Cox. Lieutenant Governor Cox, who has recently led Utah's COVID-19 task force, is by statute the chief election officer of the state and the liaison between the governor and legislature. He travels extensively through the state supporting economic development and local government solutions. He is committed to strengthening families, transforming education, increasing voter participation, utilizing modern technologies, promoting healthy living, and empowering the homeless and impoverished. I believe that the Lieutenant Governor is still working on getting connected, so when he's connected, we'll circle back and have him say hello so that you can associate his name to his and his voice together, and we'll give him an opportunity to add anything else he might want to his introduction. The next one is Michelle McComber. And Michelle is the Chief Executive Officer of the Utah Medical Association. She holds an MBA with an emphasis in healthcare administration. Prior to serving as the CEO, she was the Assistant Executive Vice President and Director of Government Relations at the Medical Association. She has also served as the Executive Director of the Utah Ambulatory Surgery Center Association and as the Chief Operating Officer of the for-profit corporation and the Director of Finance and Information Services for the Utah Hospital Association. Michelle has served in about every area of healthcare possible during her career and has seen and participated in many changes that have come to healthcare through the years. Ms. McComber, would you like to add anything to your introduction? Oh, and Michelle might be having some issues with audio. We're going to get that handled here in just a moment. While we're working on that, let me go ahead and introduce the others, and then maybe we'll just swing back around and let each of the panelists go through any additions. The next panelist is Greg Bell. Greg Bell serves as president and CEO of the Utah Hospital Association. He also serves as chair of Get Healthy Utah, a broad-based community initiative to promote active living and healthy eating among Utahns, and is the immediate past chair of UTA and USTAR, and the former chair of Envision Utah. Bell served as Utah's lieutenant governor under Governor Gary Herbert from 2009 until 2013. Previously, he served 2 terms in the Utah State Senate from Davis County. Bell is a past mayor of Farmington and chair of Envision Utah, and he is a regular columnist for Deseret News. Mr. Bell, I do see that you're connected. If you'd like to add anything to your introduction, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you. The only thing I would add is that the Utah Hospital Association, in partners with others, has been very interested in pursuing reform of our mental health care system, and we commissioned a wide-ranging study in the state of Utah of our mental health system through the Gardner Institute, which was issued, and pursuant to that, our group, in alliance with several others, was successful in having legislation passed this last year, mostly under the sponsorship of Representative Steve Elifson, and obtaining about $30 million of funding so that we can implement some very exciting changes in how we deal with mental health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bell. Rounding out our panelists is Nate Checketts. Nate Checketts is a deputy director at the Utah Department of Health and is Utah's Medicaid director. Since March 2020, he has also been coordinating Utah's COVID-19 testing activities. He has previously been the health reform coordinator for Utah Medicaid and helped develop Governor Herbert's Healthy Utah Plan. Nate has previously been the director of CHIP, a budget analyst in the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget, and a senior auditor for the California State Auditor's Office. Mr. Checketts, I think we're trying to get you into the meeting right here, and you should be able to talk right now. Would you like to add anything to your introduction?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to be part of this panel and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. And I believe we may have gotten Ms. McComber's audio handled. Would you like to try talking again, and let's see if it lets you this time?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to participate, and I think this is a very important conversation that we're having and need to continue to have through time. Physicians are an integral part of the healthcare system, regardless of where they are working, and work across the many areas of the state. And so I do appreciate the opportunity to participate. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. McComber. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator, and we're also working on getting the Lieutenant Governor in. So we might have just a moment of dead time after I've introduced Mr. Croshaw here while we get everything figured out. So the moderator for our session, we're very pleased to introduce, is Andrew Croshaw, CEO of Levitt Partners. Andrew joined Levitt Partners at its inception in 2009 and was appointed to his current role in April 2017. He has played an instrumental role in positioning Levitt Partners as one of the nation's leading healthcare intelligence firms. In his current role, he oversees the operational and strategic activities of all Levitt Partners enterprises. Mr. Croshaw, would you like to add to your introduction?
Thank you for having me, Sarah. Really pleased to be here.
All right, and we're trying to get the Lieutenant Governor in, and so give us just a minute here and we'll get this panel going. All right, I think we've got the Lieutenant Governor in. Lieutenant Governor Cox, why don't you go ahead and try unmuting yourself and let's see if it lets you talk.
All right, can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I think we're good to go. Do you want to add to your introduction before Mr. Croshaw takes us off to the panel?
Well, just thank you so much, Sarah, for giving me this opportunity. All the introduction, fantastic, and the team that you've got today, good friends of mine, incredible public servants, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
All right, and with that, Mr. Croshaw, the time is all yours.
Thank you. What a delight to be here with this panel and also at this time. I think all of us are seeing examples of where the COVID virus is freezing up communications, transactions, supply chains, ways of life. At the same time, it's creating an accelerant or a thawing of change that has perhaps been long overdue or was not expected at all. And so a lot of dynamic in the environment right now. So what a privilege it is to be together with this group of people to talk about how healthcare is changing in the midst of all of this. Lieutenant Governor, perhaps we could start with you. Really appreciate you taking the time. You're at the heart of much of the response that's happening around the state and in communities. Could you share with us what you're learning from the pandemic? And if you'd like to toss in an earthquake, which we had in the middle of this, what are we learning about our preparedness for disasters like this? And specifically, where are we less prepared than we thought? And where are we perhaps doing better than we might have expected?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Andrew, and it's been a wild couple months, I think, for all of us. There is unfortunately no instruction manual, no roadmap to getting through a pandemic. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't try to create them over time, and we have an incredible emergency preparedness staff here in the state of Utah, working with local leaders. And I had a conversation with former Adjutant General and now the person running the Department of Health, Jefferson Burton, and we talked specifically about some of the preparations for pandemics. I mean, you know, we had done tabletop exercises. We had looked to what a pandemic might look like and tried to imagine with some of the best thought leaders in this country. And his response was fascinating. He said they missed it by a mile. I think they were the actual pandemic and the speed with which it came just overwhelmed even the best experts and the best laid plans. So we have learned a couple things. One of the positive things I think we've learned is something that we knew already, and that is that Utahns stand ready to come together in the face of a disaster or a tragedy or any type of emergency. We certainly saw that with the earthquakes, something we have also been preparing for a long time, and something that was executed almost flawlessly. But where we were not prepared for this, and certainly this starts at the national level, we were fully unprepared when it comes to testing capacity and the ability to test, and that has been written about. There's a lot we could talk about around testing and why that happened. Thankfully, we were able to bring Nate Checketts on to help ramp up testing here in the state of Utah, something we did better than just about any state. So that was one area where we were definitely not prepared for what was coming. There are several others, of course, as we've gone through this, but I think the thing that stands out to me most, and people on this call have been part of that response, Greg Bell, the hospitals, Michelle, and the Utah Medical Association, but really it's the ability of Utahns to bond together and figure out our way through this. We have governors calling us all the time, asking us, how is Utah doing so much better? You know, why are our mortality rates so low? Why are our testing rates so high? Why is our economic response been better than other states? And those are things that I think we're all very grateful for, but we still have a long way to go.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I'm hearing in your response, planning ahead of time, but pretty hard to anticipate all of the the things that happen, but a real sense of adaptability and an ability to come together and solve the problems that present as part of the reason that Utah is doing so well, and it really is doing well. The last time I checked, Utah was testing at about double the national rate. There's far fewer tests, as you point out, than we need, but Utah really is leading the way, and in other indicators that you've mentioned too. So I really feel like there's a lot to be proud of about what's happening here in the state. Thank you. Nate Checketts, could we bring you in on this? You've been a part of the response as well, and part of that response has to do with testing. It also has to do with contact tracing, and you're involved in some of that work. Can you share a little bit about what's happening at the state to do that contact tracing, and is technology an important part of that?
Yeah, so the state has gone through an evolution on the way it's approached contact tracing. We, as the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, we had envisioned how some of these things might occur in different scenarios, but the pace that this one came at the state was much faster than had been anticipated in some of those previous scenarios. And the model in the state of Utah relies heavily on local health departments. They are the front line for these contact tracing events, and they had a certain staffing capacity that they had available to them. And as the epidemic started, they were able to maintain their expected workload and stay up with that contact tracing when the number of cases were low. But the cases quickly began to mount, and the state has done a couple things to help bolster those local health departments. One was that we looked across the entire state staffing and all those that are employed with the state, and looked for volunteers among the existing staff of the state, and pulled together, I believe over the course of a weekend or so, about 1,000 volunteers from different parts of the state that were willing to come and work on specific tasks related to contact tracing. And so that pool's been available to the state as we move forward and as different areas reach their capacity and local health departments are no longer able to meet the requirements. And then they can turn to the state and have either the state epidemiologist team step in and help back that up, or rely for certain activities like active monitoring of individuals once we've identified them for these volunteer teams. In addition, the state has partnered with a development firm to develop an app where individuals can do an assessment for their conditions on a daily basis. And we're looking still as to develop components of that app that would allow individuals to share with these these public health staff who they've been in contact with, the locations they've been, to help ease and facilitate and speed the work of these contact tracers. As we move to an environment where we're doing fewer stay-at-home type restrictions, the key to this is going to be that we have robust testing so that individuals that are symptomatic can quickly get in and get tested and we can identify them. And then active and aggressive contact tracing that follows up on that to make sure that if we find a positive individual, we're quickly identifying their contacts, having them also self-isolate and quarantine so that we can control the spread even in an environment where we have fewer stay-at-home type restrictions. So the app is an important part of that overall effort to make sure that we have a aggressive and proactive contact tracing stance in the state.
Andrew, may I just follow up on that a bit?
Please.
Nate, I follow the daily contact tracing statistics on the State Domo dashboard. And last week, it looked to me like clinically we were identifying new cases at about 50% of the time and tracing between 45 and 50%. This week it's slightly less. Looks like we're stabilizing around 40% of contacts are being identified by tracing. To me, that seems like the secret weapon. And I don't know what other states are doing, but if we're identifying half of new cases before new cases are identifying themselves by testing or emergency room or presenting in some way, it seems very, very successful. How would you evaluate that?
Yeah, I definitely agree that being able to identify these cases early and be able to encourage them to self-isolate and quarantine is that key, because as individuals, if they are out moving around in society and interacting with other individuals, there's that ability to spread. So definitely those ratios are looking good, and obviously we hope that we can keep improving those and making them better.
I just wanted to highlight that, Andrew. I think that is a big story that I don't know that the newspaper and other media have picked up on that.
It's a big story, and I'll just anecdotally say that someone that I'm close to was contacted by the state and asked to come in and be tested, and subsequently tested positive. In other words, they did not know they had the disease. They had not manifested symptoms yet, but because of the contact tracing, they were invited in for testing and were able to then take the appropriate action once they knew. So it is a fantastic part of, I think, the success story. Nate, you mentioned that that today this army of volunteers is helping to essentially execute on this contact tracing, but that tomorrow we may be able to unlock additional technology support in the app, so that in addition to an interview process, there might be some data that shows who a person has interacted with. Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, that's correct. And it doesn't replace the interaction that they would have with the public health staff as they're doing the contact tracing. That is still core to our response, but it is supplemental, and it is meant to enhance and speed that process. So one of the things that a contact tracer does when they interact with an individual is they talk to them about where they've been and who they've interacted with and who they've had that social interaction or those close contacts with. And that can be a lengthy process as you go back. And even if you think about your own day, if you sort of went back and said, now, who have you been in contact with today? What about yesterday? What about the day before? And would you capture in that process all of the individuals that you've been in contact with, or would you miss some as you went through that process? Depending on the features that you activate within the Healthy Together app, you can allow the app to collect that information about where you've been over the course of a certain period and share that with the public health staff so that they can have that discussion with you. You can actually go through that together, and that can help make sure that it's a complete list and also speed up that process in identifying those contacts.
That's amazing. Imagine if a college student was contacted and asked who they had interacted with during the course of the last day, the last 3 days. How hard would that be when you think about, well, I went to biology and then I went over to history, and in each case I was with a different group of students, and then I was with roommates, and then I was, walking through campus. The phone becomes a very important supplement to these interviews, especially in high traffic environments. Thank you for your comments on that, Nate. I'd like to bring Michelle McComber in, representing physicians in the state. Michelle, could you share with us what weaknesses and what strengths are being exposed in the clinician community by this pandemic?
Well, I think one of the issues that we have seen through this pandemic is that in order to treat patients, we need to have more telehealth for pandemics. And I think that was a weakness that we had in Utah. We were not prepared for the level of telehealth that we needed in this through a pandemic or through an emergency. And I think it's a strength and a weakness because now that we have seen what physicians can do, what providers can do via telehealth, I think that has pushed us forward ahead maybe a decade at least on telehealth services and where we go with that. A weakness that we had, or a weakness that we've seen in the system, was obviously we did not have access to proper PPE equipment, personal protective equipment, sorry, used to acronyms. And we did not have a supply chain to get that, much like the testing supplies. Personal protective equipment was an issue. I think the state rallied very quickly and has done an excellent job on pushing for those supplies and getting those supplies. And I also think our business community came together on this too, as well as others. We saw a call by manufacturers to switch over to producing some of this that would help us not spread the virus, and would also help patients be able to be treated. So in most areas, we were able to really bolster those needs. I think we also, though, a weakness that we have seen or noticed through this process is that maybe there wasn't enough communication and coordination in all areas of healthcare, and that needed to be strengthened. And I think some of that has been strengthened through the system. I don't think all of it has been, and I think there's a real disconnect still between maybe hospital systems and independent providers in the community, and that's a little bit of a concern. So I think that still needs to be strengthened and bolstered going forward. But those are some of the weaknesses, and even some of the strengths that we've seen, though. We did see physicians and other providers very quickly learn how that they could help the patients that they needed to help in a different way, and a little bit of innovation in monitoring kind of remotely, and again, doing the telehealth. So I think we have seen both strengths and weaknesses in the system that help us move forward in any kind of pandemic or emergency.
Thank you for those excellent insights. Would you say, Michelle, in your interaction with the physician community, what is the prevailing view on telemedicine after the pandemic? Is this something that they will put up with until they can return to normal, or are you seeing a significant change in attitude?
Oh, I think they've always wanted to. In fact, we pushed telemedicine legislation through this past year up at the legislature, because they have been saying for any number of years that we need to move towards telemedicine and telehealth as much as possible in a way that makes sense. The issue with telehealth, telemedicine, obviously, is that you cannot do all care via that kind of a channel. Surgery is very hard to do, through a teleconference call, but behavioral health is much easier to do that way, etc. So there are strengths and weaknesses to using telemedicine or telehealth. But one of the barriers to doing that is, how do we reimburse at an appropriate level to allow this to go forward in a way that makes sense? And so that has been much of the discussion as to how we sustain this after the pandemic is over.
That's a great lead in, I think, to ask the payer here, Nate Checketts, Medicaid payer, how they're thinking about that. But before we come to you, Nate, let me just remind the audience, if you'd like to submit questions for the panelists, there is a mechanism to do that. And Sarah, I'm going to look to you to explain to people what that mechanism is, but I've seen a few people find it because I'm already seeing a few questions come in. But could you just remind the audience how they submit questions, and then we'll go to Nate?
Absolutely. So for audience members who'd like to submit questions, look to the bottom and center of your screen. You should have a little Q&A button, and it might have some chat bubble looking icons there. When you click on that, go ahead and take a look through the open questions. We recommend seeing if there's anything there that already represents what you're looking to ask, and you can use the little thumbs up icon to upvote the questions that you like. If you need to enter one that is brand new, go ahead and just enter it there, and then hopefully others will be upvoting your questions and help bring them to the top of the list.
Great, thank you. And by the way, Sarah, you have one of the best voices. I'd like to hire you to moderate our dinner conversation.
Why, thank you.
I just want to do what you say. It sounds so good. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So Nate, coming to you, you're a payer. You obviously are very interested in money being well spent to treat the population over which you have stewardship, the Medicaid population here in the state. How are you thinking about telemedicine in the current environment, and where do you see where do you see it evolving from a sort of reimbursement and regulatory perspective?
Thankfully, Medicaid's always been in the position of being very supportive of the telemedicine opportunities. It's something that the program has reimbursed at the same level as other services and allowed that or not as an option for services when applicable. Obviously, in this pandemic, we're seeing higher utilization of the services, and that's a welcome addition and use of an option that's always been available. One of the other things that we had to consider as we moved into this environment was that some of our providers were not set up to meet the conditions of what telemedicine has been in state law and in Medicaid regulation up to this point, where we've been expecting that telemedicine includes both an audio and a visual component to that. And that was not working for some of our providers, smaller providers, mental health providers. And so as part of the response to the pandemic and in response to some of the emergency rules, Medicaid loosened some of its rules and allowed the telemedicine to occur strictly over audio channels, even if a visual part wasn't allowed for that. And we're hearing very good things, especially back from our mental health community, that has worked well, that the providers feel like they've been able to stay in contact with the individuals, and reports back from the members that they feel like they are getting adequately served through the process. So that's one thing that we'll need to take a look with as we exit out of the pandemic and out of the emergency rules, is how that might be an option moving forward, something that we had been more rigidly following the rules regarding telemedicine, that it be both audio and visual, to allow. Does that make sense to allow in future environments that the potential to have an audio only component of that and still reimburse at the same levels for those types of services?
Thank you for sharing that.
Andrew, can I follow up just with Nate? I do have to really thank Medicaid and Medicare for where they've gone with telehealth in the pandemic and what they have done. They reacted very quickly to needs and that patients had and providers had through this pandemic, and we are very appreciative, and we know that all providers are. We do know, though, that there have been barriers in place and continue to be barriers in place for some insurers out there in terms of following suit. Others have done very well, such as Blue Cross Blue Shield in their response for the needs for telemedicine during this pandemic.
Thank you, Michelle. Lieutenant Governor, could we ask you a question about something that has arisen in the context of the pandemic that was already a topic of discussion? It's disparities in healthcare, that some populations are disadvantaged, they have higher rates of disease, they don't enjoy the same outcomes. This was a thing that predated the pandemic, but in the course of the pandemic itself, we see infection rates and mortality rates that are different. What do you feel could be done? What is being done to try to prevent and avoid these types of situations?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So we've been talking about social determinants of health for some time. And in fact, we have projects ongoing right now. We have one in St. George. We have another project in Ogden, working with IHC and other providers to use funds that have normally been set aside for healthcare for some of these other things that help close those disparities. But all of that felt a little academic as we would talk about these issues. And this pandemic and the coronavirus have really brought it to the forefront in powerful ways and in a short amount of time. We just released the latest version of the Utah Leads Together plan. It's Utah's health and economic plan for getting things back. And in this version of the plan, what we did was we really focused on those that are most at risk. Of course, that means the elderly and those in our long-term care facilities. We now know the numbers in the state of Utah. About half the deaths in our state have come from those in long-term care facilities. We're worried about those with underlying health conditions. Of course, those if you look at the numbers, diabetics, diabetics and cardiovascular disease and some of these other issues that certainly we know that the coronavirus kind of preys upon. However, I think some of the most troubling numbers that have come out of that, and we certainly saw it first in New York and Michigan, but it's ringing true here. Those are multicultural communities, our minority communities. The Latino population here in the state of Utah makes up about approximately 15% of our citizens, and yet they're about 30% of the hospitalizations in the state. And that's not because Latinos are more susceptible to this disease or anything like that. It's because of those social determinants, those zip code issues, where you live, the way that you live. Of course, we have sometimes multiple households living together in one. Many of them are engaged on frontline activities that were where they remained working during the pandemic and during the worst outbreaks of the pandemic. But also, there's just a real lack of information. And we were holding these press conferences every day at 1:30 in the afternoon or whatever time it was. And very early on, we brought in a Spanish translator, and we're trying to get that information out. We've had the National Guard that has been working to translate the coronavirus materials from the state into 19 different languages. But even that is not enough, because again, if you're working those jobs, you're not listening to the news at 1:30 every day when the governor and the state epidemiologists are talking about this disease. And so we brought together, using the state's multicultural commission, which I chair, we brought together some of the best in our state from different communities. By the way, not just the Latino community that's being impacted, our Native American community, and we know what's happening on the Navajo Nation is one of the biggest outbreaks in the country right now, and they are working to bridge that gap, working with businesses, working with minority chambers of commerce, working again with our translation services, but to make sure that we're getting that information out. So it's not just that they don't have access to healthcare. That's certainly part of it. It's more than that. It's access to the internet, where most people get their information. It's access to good information, so that they're understanding the importance of hygiene, the importance of social distancing. And if you can't social distance, we do have options available. If someone gets sick in your household, and you've got 15 people living in a small house, we have, and a lot of people don't know this, but we have places available, motels and others, where we can quarantine people, so we don't then infect those 15 people who are sharing bathroom facilities and others. And so it really is about getting good information out. And our multicultural commission, it's a sub-task force of the state COVID-19 task force, is really working on reaching out to those communities and getting voices that are respected and understood, so that we can prevent the spread in those areas.
Would you say then, as a consequence of what you're learning and the work that you're doing, that that social determinants of health are perhaps even more important to address in the context of a pandemic and whatever associated economic burden may stem from this? In other words, is there a heightened need, in your view, to address those determinants of health?
Yeah, for sure. And I want to go back to something that Michelle said about telehealth, and how, in her words, it's advanced telehealth maybe 10 years faster than it would have otherwise. I completely agree with her, by the way. And I think that is one of the lessons we have to bring out of this. But another one of those lessons is, again, an understanding about how different communities are impacted differently. And that has advanced light years, I think, in light of what we're seeing right now. And by the way, telehealth is one of the ways to bridge some of those gaps, specifically in rural Utah. Other places, now the pandemic has not hit as hard in rural Utah. As I said, here in Fairview, where I live, we've been social distancing for 160 years. And so there has been not the same impact there, but certainly we have had a lack of access to healthcare for a long time. And telehealth, I come from the telecommunications business, and we've been pushing telehealth for a long time as one of the ways to bridge some of those gaps. And certainly we can do that not just in rural Utah, but in urban Utah and suburban Utah, as cheaper ways to get people access to good healthcare and good information.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to a question from the from the participants here. And Greg, if I could address this one.
Andrew, can I just add one other piece to that? And thank you so much to the Lieutenant Governor for all of his work. But another piece on that for the social determinants of health are low-income individuals, those who have no insurance at all and homeless, who have no access to water, soap, healthy living conditions. And that's a huge piece of this in terms of passing a virus along. And so I think that's another place where we really have to look hard at what we're doing and what we can do to help in those areas. Sorry to interrupt you on that.
No, thank you. Thank you. And I'll just also, that reminds me of something else Lieutenant Governor said about households. The single biggest contributor to disease transmission is in the same household. That's where most people are getting it, is from someone else in the household. So the resources you mentioned that are available to help families to prevent the spread, especially where there are large numbers living in the same household, are a really important part of the solution here. Greg, one of the questions that was submitted, this is along this theme of how this pandemic may be catalyzing and expediting some change. The question came in, do you feel that the pandemic has provided further justification for payment reform away from fee-for-service to something like capitated rates? Is there an accelerant happening from the pandemic with regard to that transformation? And you're on mute, by the way.
Apologize. We're seeing dislocations and innovations and disruptions, that we haven't seen in a generation. So it's exciting in that sense. Obviously, telemedicine is the easy example, and even though there have been some wrinkles, it's a no-brainer. And your clinicians are calling you and want you to come in for your checkups or your scheduled appointments, and they're switching you over to telehealth to the extent possible. When we're able to do that for dental visits, then we'll know we're in the millennium, right? We're seeing that in the workplace where everybody's working from home, and I think a lot of that's going to stick. Now, to the specific issue, I haven't felt the pressure towards away from fee-for-service from this pandemic. I think everyone understands that our ACOs are on a value-based care model and are really getting not just an amount of money. They're really starting to do some quality initiatives. They're attacking social determinants of health. You and I were involved in an extensive conversation earlier, Andrew, with other panelists today about addressing social determinants of health. And so in that sense, I think we're being pushed by the pandemic to expand those efforts in our ACOs. But I would say in the general insurance population, I've not seen that trend yet.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You're giving us a frontline view here, which is very contemporary. But I think that I'll just share my own 2 cents on this, which is that we have not experienced yet the economic consequence of the pandemic. And certainly the stock market's not responding to it yet because of the efforts being made at the federal level, largely to stimulate the economy. And hopefully that will be not the downturn that we fear. But that economic downturn, I imagine, will be a pressurizing factor in payment models. As well, one of the things that's been interesting is risk-bearing providers continue to have continuity in their payment stream when they are being paid to manage the health of a population. Whereas those providers who are operating on a fee-for-service environment have seen elective procedures and many office visits dramatically diminish for obvious reasons. And so there has been quite a different economic performance between those bearing risks so far and those not. We'll see how the story plays out as I think you're inferring here. We're still pretty early to maybe understand the impact on the transformation of payment models.
Andrew, can I add to that?
And, yeah.
Please.
So one of the things that we've definitely seen in the Medicaid program is there's a large disparity that's been occurring between some of the larger providers and the smaller providers in this environment you're talking about. Some of that is due to capitation, some of that's due to the support that the federal government has been providing to certain providers early on, and that some of their support has been lagging as it's gone out to other groups. But some of the groups where we've seen there's been significant pressure, and they are largely, many of them are fee-for-service type providers. As we look at our autism services, as we look at some of the home health, and as we look at some of the primary care services, and it depends on the different models and their relationship with the accountable care organizations. But we have seen significant pressure on those providers as they've seen their ability to provide services change dramatically, and in many cases seen a much reduced volume and how they try to maintain their staff through those periods. And so it's definitely a pressure we've seen, and seen in a greater degree with some of our smaller groups.
Thank you.
Andrew, also, there has, though, because of the pandemic, been a little bit of a stop on some of this. So we are seeing it in the Medicare Shared Savings Programs, ACOs, for instance, where the track should have started, or should start a new track beginning in 2021, but because of what has happened and how care has been disrupted for patients, that will be pushed off a year. So I think there is that side of things too happening in terms of payment and where some of this payment reform goes.
Great point. Going back to this theme of acceleration and frozen at the same time, it's so remarkable. Nate, a question here from the participants on the phone today about testing capacity. It says, given Utah's testing capacity, do you have any insight as to why testing has been restricted as the pandemic progresses? Now, you might want to clarify that or speak to that. Do you see a need for essential employees to have access to testing regardless of symptoms?
Yeah, so as the state started out in this process, capacity was extremely limited. And I think we got the message out well at that time that due to that limited capacity, we were only able to test very limited number of individuals, and they had to meet some very significant symptoms to do that. As our capacity grew, we relaxed those standards, adding additional symptoms. We're now up to 6 symptoms that if you have any of those 6 symptoms, you can come in and get tested. Expanding our efforts with contact tracing so that anyone that's referred by a public health staff person for testing can go into any of our test sites across the state and get testing. And we're still working out to make sure that that process occurs for every single individual, but the policies are in place to make that happen. So looking to the next step, the state's thought through about which asymptomatic groups would be our priorities as we expand testing and look to cover additional individuals. One of the groups that we've identified as our top priority are the long-term care facilities. Across the country, the significant number of individuals that have died from the COVID-19 have come from these types of facilities. And that's true also in Utah, although we have a low rate overall. A significant number of those who have passed away have come from nursing facilities. And so one of the areas where we've targeted this additional capacity and our efforts that we have available to us with some of our mobile testing teams has been to go out and test asymptomatic workers at those facilities to try to catch any infection early in the process before it gets carried into the facility. As we've restricted access to these facilities, the major source of infection has actually been the workers themselves as they come in and treat and care for those individuals. So that's one area where we've tried to match up our goals and interests related to the availability of capacity and our policies related to that. We've also done some work related to the critical infrastructure groups in the state. We've worked with the oil patch workers, with power plants, with agricultural workers, refineries, those essential employees in those industries. We've partnered up with those industries and either provided an opportunity for them to go to a test site to go and get testing, or we've sent a mobile team to specific locations to help those individuals get tested. Or in other cases, the industry themselves actually has a medical clinic that can collect the samples, and they just needed our help with either getting the collection kits or getting those tests processed. So we've been doing across the state with a variety of different partners, really focusing in on the critical infrastructure group and trying to make sure that those essential employees have access to testing. We're starting to do some additional work looking at broader pilots related to businesses overall. And we've done some work in that area, but we're still looking to see, based on the state's budget and the ability to pay for those tests going forward, how to best match up the interest in that type of testing and the ability of the state to pay for that testing.
Nate, thank you for both the clarification there as well as some of those examples. Let me just ask, perhaps Lieutenant Governor, I could start with you, and then if others have thoughts on this. This is a question that comes from a participant about the Navajo Nation, and of course an acknowledgement that that population has been hit harder than the general population. Do you feel like there are special steps we could be taking, that we are taking to help those populations, especially those that reside within the area of our state?
Yes, absolutely there are. And we've been working very closely with President Nez of the Navajo Nation. He's a good friend of ours. In fact, there's been a little bit of consternation because the Navajo Nation covers multiple states, of course, Arizona and New Mexico, and Utah has been the most responsive, even though we have maybe a lower population for the nation. But we gladly do it because it is so important. And we were the first to send down our mobile testing units to help understand where the virus was, where it was spreading, make sure that they had capacity and access to testing in those areas. We've also been very engaged on the humanitarian side. The governor's deputy chief of staff was just there last week together with our agriculture community, who has been in one of the what I think is really a model to the nation, where we are raising money to buy agriculture goods from our farmers who are struggling with markets and supply chain issues, and then using that excess supply and taking that to the Navajo Nation. We've been delivering lamb and live sheep, which is really important to our Navajo friends, and so we are committed. We have weekly, actually daily updates on reaching out to our incident command, reaching out to not just the Navajo Nation, but all of our Native American groups within the state, but with particular focus on them and what's happening down there, and making sure that they have everything that they need to weather this storm.
Wonderful to know. Thank you for sharing that. Any other comments from other panelists on this topic? If not, I'm going to move to another topic.
This is Nate. As the Lieutenant Governor mentioned, we've had the opportunity to send down our mobile testing teams to that area. We've actually had 3 different trips go down there, 1 for 4 days and 2 for 2 days each, and been able to collect thousands of samples from the community there. And actually, if you look at a statewide map now of the per capita testing around the state, San Juan County is actually now the highest tested per capita in the state. Because of those missions that have gone down there and really focused in conjunction and with the support of the Navajo health system down there, really working hand in hand with them to do that testing. So that's been a great partnership.
Thank you very much. One more question, and then I'd like to do just a wrap up with each of the panelists before our time expires here. So if we could do this one quickly, it's an important one, and it has to do with the staffing, the clinical staffing levels. Some of the participants may not know that Utah ranks as one of the worst states in the nation as it relates to physicians per capita. This is especially true in rural communities in our state. Could we direct this question to you, Michelle? what are some of the things that we could do to address the clinical staffing levels, I'll call them, in our state?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things. We do rank about 46th or 47th out of the 50 states for physicians per capita, and I know other healthcare workers are not necessarily at similar levels, but close. And so we do need to keep our healthcare system healthy in terms of going forward. We have a breakdown of those who are employed, those who are independent, and what have you, and we need to keep that healthy moving forward. And it's been very hard during the pandemic. It has hit physicians particularly hard, as well as others during this pandemic. And one of the things that that providers look for when they come to Utah, or when they're recruited to Utah, is, can I get on insurance panels? And through the years, we've seen shrinking insurance panels. So that's one of the dilemmas in terms of, you know, how do we continue to get healthcare workers, physicians, and others to come to the state of Utah and to participate in our healthcare system here. You have to be able to sustain yourself, to be able to, you know, provide for other workers in your office and in your clinic, etc. And so that's one of the big issues that really we need to take a look at again. So adequate payment for healthcare providers. Obviously, lifestyle is a big choice when people look at where they go and where they're recruited. And so that is one place where we definitely have an advantage for providers to come to the state of Utah, for physicians to come. But again, I think we need to look at how can we make sure that as our population grows, that our providers per population don't go down, which they have for a number of years, or they've stayed steady, but at the low end of provider per capita. So that's one of the things that I would push for, is making sure that we have adequate insurance panels with adequate providers, and particularly physicians. We've seen in some areas of the state where, you know, there's no, for instance, orthopedic surgeon in that area because a panel or an insurance company thinks that's sufficient providers throughout the state, etc.
Thank you. That's one of those examples of hard to do via telemedicine, right? The orthopedic procedure. So
Yeah.
the topic of this panel was the healthcare landscape in Utah after the pandemic. So as a way to close out here in the next few minutes, could I just ask each of the panelists for your answer to the following question? Healthcare in Utah, better or worse after the pandemic, and why? And you get extra points if you don't include telemedicine, because that's too easy in the answer. So healthcare in Utah after the pandemic, better or worse, and why? And Greg, could we start with you? Oh, and you're on mute.
I apologize. Number one, we always tend to forget various activities of public service that haven't had a crisis recently, and one of those is public health. So for a while at least, I think it's going to be easier to get funding and personnel and the right kind of strength in our public health system. We need it, and it has been starved. It's really sad, and we're seeing the deficiencies, and the reason the lieutenant governor doesn't sleep is because we have just a lot of holes in our public health system. I mean, let's just be blunt about it. And the second thing is, we have to, our hospitals and healthcare systems and doctors and clinics know how to deal with these infections, but we have got to get our population back to seeing their doctors. We're seeing strokes, heart attacks, emergent conditions, chronic conditions not being treated because people are concerned about COVID. Informally, I was talking to one of our large hospital systems. I'm not at liberty to share their statistics, but their worker rate of infection is astonishingly low, effectively zero, including the team that went to New York to help them back there. There are no infections. So we know how to do this. We just have to get the word out. In the long term, we're seeing that we have a remarkable cadre of physicians, specialists, healthcare professionals, and hospitals. We're so fortunate here. But I really hope we can move this along to value-based payment and to at-risk provision of care. That's where I want to go.
Excellent. Thank you. Michelle, could we go to you next on that?
Yes, thank you. I agree with what Greg said to a great extent. So I will add to that. So we do have, we're seeing bad outcomes for patients, or at least difficult things to deal with for patients because they're not going to the emergency rooms. They're afraid of getting infected and what have you. I think we will see fear for quite a while after the pandemic in terms of particularly some vulnerable populations and even those who really drastically need health care not going in for care, not going in for service. I do also know that we have sectors of healthcare and healthcare workers, from physicians on down to other workers, who have been hurt by this pandemic in terms of their ability to even stay in practice, to stay focused in healthcare. And that's a concern. So I think particularly right after, if the pandemic, if we really say it ends, I don't know that it will end, but as it changes, I think we will see not as much healthcare available, at least out in the communities, to patients. But then it will get, it will slowly get better. We will move on with what we are working on, but we will have new innovations in healthcare and where healthcare is going. And I think, again, we've moved, not talking about telemedicine, but everything that we've done, remote monitoring and other things. I think we have moved the dial drastically in the direction of maybe changing healthcare and how it is delivered in the future, and where we go with that. Could be that we move some procedures even out of hospitals, out into outpatient settings, more into outpatient settings, like we've seen slowly happening through the years. But I do believe that we will see a change in how healthcare is done, so that when, not if, but when the next pandemic hits at some point in time, we have a slightly changed healthcare system that is able to more, to being able to better handle what healthcare needs we have.
Thank you. Let's go to Nate, and then the last word to Lieutenant Governor Cox. And Nate, remember, we're almost out of time and your boss hasn't spoken.
So I'll just say quickly, the grants we're receiving right now are set up for 30 months. We still have a ways to go before we're out of this, and there may be future reoccurrences or events that we'll need to watch even within this current pandemic. I think we've learned a lot of good lessons about how to appropriately staff our clinics and how to protect those workers. But I think the key to having a continued good system related to this will be able to retain those lessons and continue them on to the future beyond just this crisis period.
Lieutenant Governor, please. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah, so I'll be brief, but two things. I see the future. I'm very optimistic. I think it's going to be better for healthcare in the long run. And two reasons why. One, Greg stole mine, and he's absolutely right. I was on a county commission that said as a county commissioner, I was on the board of our central Utah Public Health Department. I was the chair during the H1N1 virus and response. And we have woefully underfunded and ignored public health. We don't care about them until we need them. And this, at least in the short run, will change attitudes and get us the funding that we need to really supplant and improve what's happening in public health. The second one that no one has mentioned is I truly believe that we will see a new group of nurses and doctors and physicians, people who are interested in healthcare and medicine coming out of this, much like we saw an increase in people joining the military and becoming firefighters and police officers after 9/11. I really do think we're going to see the same thing, because we are recognizing the valuable contributions that our healthcare providers give to us. We're finally paying attention to them and treating them like the heroes they are. They deserve every bit of it, and it's going to inspire a new generation of people to want to serve people in healthcare.
Wonderful, thank you. And thanks to all of you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of the panelists, Lieutenant Governor, Michelle McComber, Nate Checketts, Greg Bell. We really appreciate you lending us your expertise for today. At this point, I would also like to extend a thank you to our fantastic moderator, Andrew Croshaw from Levitt Partners. You did wonderfully. And I'm going to close us out with two exciting announcements. The first one is that you may have seen UHIN's recent announcement that we are now able to provide real-time COVID-19 lab alerts. Providers and care managers can be notified if their patients test positive. So please feel free to reach out to us for more information. And I've got our enrollment@uhin.org email up there on the screen. The second very quick announcement is save the date. Our annual HIT conference is scheduled for November 10th. So keep an eye on your emails, because we'll be sending out more details soon. With that, we'd like to thank you for your time, your attention, and your questions, and we wish you a great rest of the day.